Huge mountains surrounded the valley, dotted with green forest. Loud footsteps echoed above the trees, raising dozens of birds. A large red orc with spiked shoulders and a wooden club walked slowly down the path. His sharp teeth and large forehead put fear into any creature unlucky enough to encounter him. "Gadis!" Suddenly a woman's voice was heard behind the creature's back, calling out to him. Standing under a tree, the ogre woman in a black top pointed to the child who was following the man holding onto his clothes. She wondered why the human child was with him. Turning back around, he recognized his familiar Mizary. The girl that followed him was in the carriage the ogre had attacked while picking fruit nearby. She had grown quite attached to him and was not a step behind. The child from the wagon did not want to let go of his robes in any way. From the outside, it looked like she had no one else to trust, so she followed him. With flashing eyes, the woman asked, with a predatory look at the human child, would she be their dinner? Looking at the girl, the ogre seemed to ponder on what to answer, but still agreed to the ogre woman's assertion to save his reputation. All the while, the girl seemed to be out of breath. As if mesmerized, she walked simply forward, even though she was following someone. But raising her eyes, she saw a huge creature that was many times bigger than her. Even the ogre himself was surprised that she looked at him. At the same moment, the girl smiled broadly, eyes sparkling. Now a joyful expression adorned her dirty face and disheveled hair. Both orcs awed and blushed. They were amazed at her angelic cuteness and carefree nature. The child in the baggy and dirty clothes of a slave continued to wave her hand in which she held the core of the apple tightly, drawing everyone's attention. Making a low bow, she thanked the creature for the favor he had done her. Covering her face with her hand, Mizary said with a tremor in her voice that the child was most likely thanking Gadis for giving her the fruit. But the equally confused ogre shivered and replied that it was just a thank you for helping her and nothing more. The smile left the girl's face when she heard this from the orc. Seeing such a pitiful picture, the ogre awkwardly scratched his head thinking of what to say. In his opinion, there was nothing wrong with what he had done, but he couldn't find the right words. Both girls began to laugh, and Gadis continued to stand there, not understanding what was wrong. Suddenly a rustling of bushes was heard behind them. A red head began to emerge from beneath the greenery. Despite who was in front of him, the unknown man was shouting to his bro to show the food he had managed to find. Folding her arms across her chest, the female ogre recognized her acquaintance. His name was Muba, and he was late for their appointment. He was dressed in lighter-colored clothes and was holding berries and fruit in his hands confusedly. The child hid behind Gadis's leg, afraid of the stranger. Noticing her fear, he introduced Muba to her. Realizing that the friend's acquaintance was her friend too, the girl smiled brightly. She was like a dog that missed her owners and was very happy for their return. Seeing her behavior, the new acquaintance blushed with cuteness that amazed everyone. Moving closer to the other ogre, he asked what kind of person he was. To this, even Gadis didn't have a coherent answer. However, Mizary was quick to correct him. Gadis brought her for tonight's dinner, she replied wryly. Even Muba couldn't believe what he had done. Feeling his reputation bursting at the seams, he shouted out a few phrases. How dare they question him? After all, it was obvious that the great Gadis, who instills fear in children, would do this, even though the girl still didn't understand the meaning of the word dinner. Gadis pretended to think she was as evil as all humans, and he was very curious if it tasted good. Seeing the huge hand that approached her face and blocked the light of the sun, the child did not even move and only watched the movements with interest. The orc took with one hand a boulder that was bigger than his head and asked the girl to watch. When he tensed his muscles, the stone quickly burst under the force and shattered into small pieces. Relaxing his hand, the pieces of stone sprinkled on the ground in front of the lurid girl's eyes, who opened her mouth in surprise. He did it to show her that ogres were to be feared and hoped she would understand, but the desired effect was not seen. The other ogres looked at him unhappily and asked why he was doing this if he had only succeeded in surprising the child. This only impressed her, which made Gadis confused. The girl, instead of being frightened, looked on with surprised eyes, wanting the performance to continue. Looking at Mizary, he tried to find excuses for what had happened, but his thoughts were interrupted by strange sounds. The child, who had been standing smiling and listening to the conversation between the friends, was surprised by the strange tune. It was the rumbling of her stomach, clutching at which she tried to muffle it. The child was hungry. What she had been given recently was clearly not enough, Mizary emphasized. Looking at her hand, Muba asked if this was something she would like to eat. Moving his hand closer to the girl, who was looking at the food with delight, he offered to take some. However, instead she turned sharply towards Gadis, continuing to stare at him. Smacking himself in the face, the ogre calmly replied for her to stop looking at him. If she wanted to eat something, she could do whatever she wanted. Grabbing the first apple from his hand, the lurid girl looked at her food for a long time, wiping the occasional saliva. Even the praise from the female ogre didn't make her smile as much as Gadis's praise. The ogres did not share her happiness and looked at each other while she ate her food. After eating about half of the sweet nectar, she noticed that everyone was looking at her. Turning around to face them, she smiled radiantly, as sincerely as she could. Everyone stood in silence, not realizing what was going on while their food felt perfectly safe. Mizary's eyes stared insidiously at Gadis. With a wide grin on her face, she asked what the man would do with the child. Casting his eyes aside and covered in sweat, the ogre replied that he would put off eating that girl for later. However, he emphasized that he had not said that he did not want to eat her. All Gadis was doing was making the food grow taller, bigger, and fatter. Right now, the little girl was too small and skinny to eat. That's why he's not going to cook her today. So he also asked to be understood correctly, without twisting the words. Muba was the only one who didn't suspect anything and believed everything they said. Mizary just said, okay. Leaving the child's life alone, they took her to a small village. This was their secret base. It used to belong to humans, but now the ogres and the girl could do whatever they wanted here. As they approached the wooden building, Gadis lifted the door and took it to the side. For the moment, it was better to use this particular building, for it was the least damaged. The girl followed him, so the ogre looked at the child and warned her not to even think about running away. She had to realize what would happen if she tried to do so. However, it seemed that she didn't even listen to him. A huge haystack lay on the wooden floor, beckoning her to lie down on it. Muddy quickly moved closer to it and looked around the place. Behind the straw lay a dirty blanket. She grabbed it and nimbly dashed past Gadis, coming closer and closer to the well. A large wooden bowl stood beside it, into which the girl poured water and soaked the blanket. She washed it as quickly as she could and hung it up to dry. Finished with her chores, she turned to the ogre that had been watching her actions and smiled as she waved her small hand. She was happy that she had done everything quickly, so she ran back into the house, stomping her feet loudly. Now that she was done with the cloth, it was time to start on the hay that was lying there so carelessly. She spent a long time folding it, trying to get it into some geometric shape, kicking up dust into the air. Toward evening, the sheet dried, swaying in the wind and warming in the sunlight. Taking it to her, the child deftly spread the cloth across the straw. Now they had a makeshift bed. It wasn't a bad result for Gadis. Propping his chin with his hand, he praised the child. In his humble opinion, it was a well-made human bed. Moving closer to the ogre, the mute girl pointed her hand to a place to sleep, offering to rest. The orc was taken aback by this, for he had no idea it had been made for him. However, after the mute girl made a bow, he realized that it was. But after a few seconds, Gadis became angry, yelling at her. In his opinion, ogres couldn't sleep on such fluffy beds. It was only good if only humans used it, and the child was just that, a human. The girl tried to stop his screams by sticking her hands out in front of her and closing her eyes. She didn't think she should be treated so kindly. It would be too presumptuous of her to use it for herself. It was sad that she was not understood. The weight of such a life even made the child bow her head. The ogre, on the other hand, shrank from it as well. He couldn't bear it, but he couldn't say no either. The rest of the gang watched the whole situation. Unable to bear the torment of his conscience, Gadis took the girl under his arm and laid down on the bed with her. Mizary, standing in her typical stance with her hands on her chest, didn't understand why an ogre and a human child were sleeping together on a human bed. Muba alone marveled at his brother. Leaving this absurd situation, the female ogre left waving her hand at them. The sun was already beginning to set over the horizon, leaving the background behind Mizary, who was sitting on a wooden deck holding her stomach. She frowned, looking at the wok without stopping to drool. She wanted to eat very badly. Her thoughts of food were interrupted by a noise near the bed building. A baby's head peeked out from behind the door jamb, looking around. She ran merrily past an ogre, a woman who was sitting there looking sad. The girl crouched down beside a small barrel that stood surrounded by nibbled bones that she had actually picked up. She took a few of them and carried them to the dry grass that grew under the weak fence posts. Suddenly a voice was heard behind her, wondering what she was doing. The child was a little confused, afraid that she was about to be reprimanded or even beaten. However, Mizary assured her that everything was fine. She knew these places pretty well, so she went over to help her. Before doing anything, however, the female ogre covered her nose with her hands and openly ordered the lurker to wash herself because she stank badly. The girl had expected anything but this. Her dirty skin, black soiled clothes, and disheveled hair hinted at it. When it was told to her forehead, however, the child realized on her own that it was indeed time to start her water routine. Taking the dirty child by the hand, the ogre woman led her to a small pond nearby. Having taken off all her clothes, Mizary asked the girl to do the same and go into the water. But the muddied girl just went in there in her dirty clothes. Female ogre grabbed the hem of her dress and pulled it over the child's head. She wished the girl would let her help now and then. As she hung up the laundered dress, Mizary told the girl to make sure she washed well and not to go too deep in the water. While she was busy hanging up her clothes, her side vision was drawn to something on the child's back. Her entire body was scarred from the slings that had left not a speck of life on her. The girl couldn't speak, or perhaps didn't even want to speak herself, so it was impossible to know where the scars came from. Her number was 013. The mark of a slave was right on her left leg. Mizary, on the other hand, didn't understand how anyone could be so ruthless as to mutilate a child like that. There were too many questions in the female ogre's mind, and probably would have added a few more if not for the loud scream. Gadis flew into the area where the girls were bathing, calling loudly for Mizary. He was worried that he couldn't find the small human anywhere. Turning away from him, she covered all her charms and screamed loudly in surprise. The girl repeated the same thing after her. Mizary was shaking with anger and was sure that as soon as she got out of the water, she would beat him up. Realizing that he was in trouble, he quickly got out of the water, but it didn't save him from a couple of bumps on his head. Mizary, already dressed, gritted her teeth and turned to the ogre. Now he didn't have to worry about missing anymore. He was also called a pervert, but he held his head in his hands and said it was just an accident. That excuse didn't sit well with her, and an angry Mizary yelled at him, explaining that girls were different from shitty bastards like him. But Gadis had asked him not to call everything shitty when something bad happened. The child had been hanging around the ogre all this time worrying about him. Trying to get out of the situation somehow, he asked the child if she thought so too. The child didn't even think that she would be asked about it, so she looked away. But it was already clear that the child was of the same opinion as Mizary. As revenge, the girls, laughing loudly, forced Gadis into the water as well. Muba alone watched the situation quietly, repeating over and over again how long it had been since his brother had bathed. Night came as quickly as evening. The bright moon fully illuminated the village, in the center of which a fire burned. The wood that was in it was constantly crackling, sending sparks of light up into the sky. Muba, who slept sitting up, was in charge of the fire. Mizary lay nearby for company. The huge ogre, as if under hypnosis, got up in the middle of the night and went somewhere. He wasn't fully awake yet, so he wasn't really looking at the road. In his drowsy state, he walked past Mizary into the forest to go to the forest to use, and accidentally stepped on that small light. The ogre didn't even notice what he had done and only carelessly said, "Oops." When he was done with his business, he quickly went back to sleep. The night passed quietly, and only the rays of the rising sun, which fell on the eyes, could wake the sleeping ogres. The girl slept peacefully on her soft and warm bed, watching pleasant dreams. However, the bright and warm light did not leave her alone either. It irritated her eyes, causing her to wake up. She wiped her eyes with her little hand to wake up quickly and get on with things. The child assumed she would be the first to see her savior, but no such luck. She was in the room all alone. There wasn't even a hint that anyone else was with her. All the while, the girl looked around, afraid that she had been abandoned again. Panic overtook the child, plunging her into horrible memories. However, the loud voices that came from behind the door brought her to her senses, chasing away the bad thoughts. Quickly jumping off the bed, she ran to the doorway, watching the situation. Gadis was reprimanding his subordinate. He couldn't believe that the man who was watching the fire had accidentally put it out himself. The female ogre was disturbed by the situation. Without the fire, they were like without hands. Something had to be done, and as soon as possible. Hearing their conversation, the girl was glad that she was finally able to find them. Crossing his arms over his chest, Gadis sighed sadly. What was done, but the question of how to solve this problem remained open. Mizary had offered to buy fire from a traveling merchant, but it was foolish to rely on them. Gadis was sure that they would, as always, only deceive them and no more. But if that was the case, the woman suggested stealing some fire seeds from a human village, or, at the very least, from passing adventurers. That option was more realistic, especially since they couldn't use fire magic. The hitherto silent Muba had asked to do it himself. He had already seen some kind of light on the eastern edge of the forest yesterday, so he planned to go there. The child who had been listening to them all this time looked off into the distance. It was a long way to go there. However, an extinguished campfire, of which only embers remained, lay lonely at the ogre's feet. There seemed to be no way to light it anymore. But the girl, though she could not speak, was not lacking in intelligence. Everything she needed was in the wooden room where she slept. The human child quickly ran to an old chest of drawers, which had been in the same place for years. On it lay a dusty stone the size of her palm. Taking it in her hands, the child did one rash thing. She blew the dust off it and instantly regretted it. All the dust that rose to the top made her sneeze loudly. But now she had 2 pebbles that could be used as a firebrand and a firebrand. Taking these things in her hands, she ran out of the house to the ogres, who were still talking excitedly about the plan of action. She smiled cheerfully as she ran towards them. All she wanted at that moment was to help them and get praise. Holding 1 stone in each hand, she waved at the company of monsters, giving various signs. However, no one paid any attention to her and continued to talk. Gadis suggested waiting until deep into the night. Then he would sneak around the back of the village and steal the fire seeds as quickly as possible before escaping. While it wasn't a bad plan, things could be made simpler. Meanwhile, the human child kept waving and jumping at the same time, trying to deliver valuable information. At one point she succeeded. Gadis looked at her and asked her to wait a few minutes, for they were having a very important conversation. That's when the child was disappointed in their mental abilities. She was amazed that no one cared that she wanted to help. Since she couldn't say it, she decided to at least show it with actions. Running back to the wooden fence where she had stacked the bones yesterday, the girl picked some herbs. The ogres didn't seem to care at all what the child wanted to tell them, or what she was going to do, so they kept talking. The child also added small twigs and straw to the pile of dried wood, so she had a small handmade fire that could be lit without much difficulty. So picking up across from the ground, she began to beat them against each other with great force. Sparks flew from them in different directions, but not on the dry straw, but the child did not give up. Loud and at the same time, sharp sounds reached the ogre's ear. A few seconds later, a certain odor that Mizary couldn't believe reached him as well. Turning their heads in the direction of the sound, they saw a girl sitting there blowing sparks. She was the only one who could start a fire. Not believing what was happening, they all ran up to her shouting loudly all the way. A pleased goddess asked the child how she had done it, and if she had fire magic. Female Ogre and Muba, on the other hand, just praised the resourceful child. Mizary stroked her on the head, repeating that she had done a great job. This person was amazing to them, a real catch. When Mizary stopped tormenting her, Gadis stroked her head next. Even the praise from the female ogre didn't make her smile as much as Gadis's praise. The girl was beginning to be of use to them, which they were actually surprised by, but no less pleased. They didn't have to worry about getting fire anymore. As they moved her small fire to a larger one, the flames grew stronger, making the dime rise up over the height of the trees. The man who first saw it reported to Alfred that he could see smoke over the mountain. The guy with the headband furrowed his eyebrows menacingly. Only monsters could do that, but what was Charlie thinking? The old man in iron lats, who was also looking through the binoculars, was certain that there shouldn't have been any human settlements in this region, and also agreed that it was the work of monsters. Only the lone female sorceress stood silently and stayed out of their conversation. However, should they go there? Brave Alfred raised his hand in the air and replied that it was a matter of course. For love, justice, and peace, they had to destroy those monsters. Now that they were able to build a fire anywhere, they could think about food. Gadis, together with the child, went deep into the forest in search of fruit. Luckily, besides them, there were also mushrooms growing among the grass at this time, which the girl looked at with curiosity. Her hand reached out to pick a few, but the ogre warned her that she should not eat them, as they would spoil her stomach. The man ordered her to forget about the mushrooms and come over to him. He had something better and more nutritious. Ogre stood in a small orchard where fruit trees grew. Here the child would be able to pick some fruit, and it should be fairly easy to do so. But he also warned her not to pick green fruits, as they were not ripe yet. Having decided to leave the girl alone, he went deep into the forest, warning the child not to relax and not to go far from this place. The girl listened to him and tried to pick some juicy fruits, but her height was not enough. The trunk of the tree looked quite thick, so although it was difficult for her to climb it, it was quite feasible. Grabbing onto the nearest branch, the child scrambled up the tree with her feet. When she climbed a little further, she was able to reach several apples. Gadis, who was no longer so sure of his idea of leaving the human child alone, watched. The ogre continued to watch as her short arms reached for the dangling delicious fruit. It was ripe, so once she grasped it, she was able to pluck it with ease. There was no limit to the girl's happiness when she managed to get the food herself, without anyone else's help. Gadis laughed softly so that the child wouldn't hear. Now she would be busy for a while. Leaving her to herself, he continued on his way to the edge of the cliff. He didn't even notice the cliff in front of him. A loud scream and the ground shaking caught the human child's attention. The ogre was lying on his back at the foot of the cliff, holding his head. This cliff had definitely ruined his beautiful day. Jumping down from the tree, the girl ran toward the cliff from where Gadis's screams could be heard. As she ran, she heard the rustling of bushes behind her, which could not be ignored. The child thought that other ogres had heard Gadis' screams and had come to help, so she ran to meet them. Meanwhile, the ogre had risen to his feet and was looking up at the top of the cliff. He waited for his friends to come to his aid, while thinking about how to save himself. When the child drew the thick bushes aside, 3 strange men who were in full uniform looked up at her. Alfred, at the head of his team, announced that they had heard a loud sound and had followed him. However, contrary to what they expected, in front of them stood a little girl who had inexplicably found herself in the thick of the forest. The child only looked at the strangers excitedly. They beckoned her to come closer, because now it was their duty to take her to the camp that the heroes had set up nearby. The sheer number of words the people were saying made the girl panic more and more. She moved closer and closer to the edge of the cliff, fearing for her life. A few more steps and she could fall, because under her weight even a few rocks fell down. They rolled right to the foot of the ogre, who was listening to what was happening above. He didn't know how to react in this situation, so while he was thinking, the men grabbed the child and led the way. Gadis, on the other hand, turned in a completely different direction. He found a new path that led to their camp where Muba and Mizary were sitting. She listened to his story and asked if he had just abandoned her. The orc didn't want to admit it, though. After all, he hadn't abandoned anyone. He just didn't see any reason to fight that adventurer just to get that human child back. Ogre didn't want them to think that he was worried about the girl, so he emphasized that he meant that Mizary would be displeased. After all, it's not nice to have your food stolen that you left for emergencies. However, she interrupted the ogre because no one had even mentioned it. She was extremely angry. Mizary angrily pointed at the ogre and interjected, "Did he really mean to tell her that he genuinely thought the little man would be much happier with these people?" But the ogre insisted that he was too bloodthirsty for such merciful thoughts. He's not that nice to humans. Muba, on the other hand, who sat listening to their conversation, supported his friend. Realizing that it was useless to pursue this conversation any further, Mizary, holding her head, sat down on a log. She didn't care enough about the little brat Gadis had decided to take in, so she left him alone. Turning away from him, she went to bed. Ogre didn't understand what she was getting at, but she brushed it off and told him to ignore her words. That didn't solve the misunderstanding, however, and Gadis spent half the night thinking about what she had said. Meanwhile, the full moon shone on the entrance of the cave from which the warm light of the fire poured. At the camp where they had pitched their tents, Alfred asked Charlie if the first thing to do was to take the child back to the city. Though they had not yet defeated the monsters, it was still important to get rid of them. But they were in no hurry. So, looking at the way things were going, the boy suggested that they take the child to a safe place first. The contented old man laughed and praised the clever kid who was worried about a little-known child. The girl who was walking nearby also joined in the conversation, because that's what Alfred was all about, and she also liked the idea. The boy was clearly embarrassed, so he replied that he was just doing what was expected of adventurers, because he was not some passerby. The boy and the girl were blushing thicker and thicker, as if a scarlet flower had just bloomed, which was clearly visible under the flames of the fire. Watching the boys, Charlie smiled, repeating one phrase, "Hey, youth." Embarrassed at being burned, Alfred shouted loudly for the old man to stop talking nonsense. Coughing a little and lowering the timbre of his voice, the guy with the bandage returned to the original conversation. Anyway, tomorrow they should leave the camp and take the unfortunate child back to the city. Both companions who had traveled with him for not the first year agreed with his words. However, the girl alone sat sadly in his eyes near the wall where a thin tree grew. She was tied by the neck and held in her hands the very apple she had managed to pick. Beside it, she was given a glass of water and some gruel. She sat doomedly with her head bowed to the loud laughter of the adventurers. Who would have thought they would stumble upon a runaway slave? The man she had escaped from would surely be overjoyed when they brought the child back. Alfred really cared about the others. The girl praised the boy. As the new day dawned, the adventurers left their rest area and headed into town. The girl was still being dragged by the rope that was tied around her neck. She did not eat the fruit that had been left over from the last time she had met Ogre, but kept it as the apple of her eye, holding it close to her heart at all times. Alfred turned to the girl who was walking behind and asked what was the matter and why she was lagging behind. However, the sorceress apologized, for she was sorry for that. The girl she was leading was too slow and was slowing her down. The gray-haired old man was twirling a rod in his hands and chided that the child must be too relaxed and needed to be taught a lesson, but the boy stopped him. Charlie had already beaten her at camp, so other methods had to be used. The kid with the headband didn't like exerting force for the sake of having the others listen to him, so asked to be allowed to deal with it. The girl was amazed at Alfred's kindness, which even the old man agreed with. The young man knelt down in front of the child and took her by the shoulders. He shook the girl and asked her to listen to him because this forest is full of goblins and other dangerous monsters. In his opinion, she was very lucky to be alive and well until now. So instead of running away and praying to live another day, the guy advised her to better start serving her master and getting food with a safe place to sleep. Alfred emphasized that just being alive was already a much more respectable thing than dying in the forest for no good. The boy tried to cheer the child up. He assured her to return to the city with her little legs, for he believed she could do it faster. However, the girl's gaze was dull and her eyebrows drew together in a crease. She was clearly making it clear that she didn't want to do anything, no matter how much she was asked. With her slingshot-wounded hands, she held onto the apple and pressed it harder and harder against her. Alfred was amazed that with all the effort he had put into coaxing her, he had failed to inspire the girl. His logic wasn't working on her. Most likely it was because she was a slave, the gray-haired old man replied, adjusting his iron helmet. Turning to the boy, he replied that he, as a man who leads others, should always remember something important. Since ancient times, everyone has known that slaves have a rotten nature from birth, so they are condemned to a life of servitude. They are lazy but at the same time cunning, so they try to get advantages even without exerting themselves. However, since they are fools who do not see the beautiful things, they will not even be able to see the future. Free people have always only had one duty, to guide these shallow slaves so that they can bring some benefit to their masters. Charlie stuck to his beliefs to what he was teaching the young lad. Spreading his arms to the side, Alfred shrugged his shoulders. By now, he was tired of the older man's moralizing. But that didn't make the smaller child stubborn. She didn't even want to listen to him, so the kid gave up. He, despite all the disagreements with the child, still asked Charlie not to hurt her too much because she already belonged to someone. The rod in the gray-haired man's hand slapped quietly against his other glove with each movement. The maniacal desire to kill someone was evident in his gaze. As soon as he raised his hand to strike, the girl instantly squeezed her eyes shut as hard as she could, waiting for more blows. Meanwhile, the orc base was completely silent. Such silence was weighing on their minds. They were clearly missing the little child that had been running around them for the past few days. Gadis sat in the wooden structure on the bed that the human child had created. There was no longer that little ball of sunshine that was basking in the morning sunlight that was streaming through the cracks of the window. The ogre obviously missed her, but he couldn't show himself to the others like that, so he sat there alone. He went into the forest where there were fruit trees and picked one fruit. The apple immediately broke into small pieces, the juice of which left a sticky residue on the palm of his hand. He had once again spent too much energy, which frightened Muba a little. Gadis's subordinate's mind flashed back to the last words the female ogre had spoken after the child had disappeared. Was his friend really worried about the girl after what Mizary had said? If he was, Muba pointed with his hand in the direction. He had already seen the smoke that was rising from the eastern side of the forest, so it could very well have been those people. However, the orc with spiked shoulders abruptly burst out, calling that one a jerk. There was no way he could care about some human child. But even Muba awkwardly scratched his cheek and said that he wished he could escort her after she used fire magic just to help them. For Gadis, it didn't need to be said twice. It was just a shame his friend was only mentioning it now. He should have mentioned it sooner because he was bored, so he was going to go with him to the girl. Literally tearing the trees off the road, he shouted to the other ogre to show him the way. Halfway through the forest, they came upon a cave where people had slept earlier. However, the fire had gone out, and there was no sign of the girl. There was no one there, and a little smoke from the branches indicated it, but they were lucky that they had left recently. They had missed each other by a small amount of time, but was it necessary to keep looking for them? Unwittingly, Gadis glanced up at the tree and noticed the bark had been rubbed in a circular pattern, with drops of red liquid on the ground around it. Getting on all fours, the ogre looked closely at these fresh stains that soaked the ground. Smelling them, Gadis definitely realized that they belonged to a human child. Without a moment's hesitation, he jumped off the ground and rose to his feet, standing up to his full height. Muba had no idea why his familiar had jumped up so abruptly and was heading somewhere. Gadis left the man alone, and without looking back, he ran through the forest. He ran as fast as he could past the huge rocks that were observed all over the mountain. Not even the massive boulders that blocked his path stopped him. With a shout of "Get out of the way," he simply smashed them to pieces. Behind another broken boulder, he could see the end of the road. Beyond that was only a cliff that was slightly larger than the one he had fallen from the other day. At its foot stood 3 men and a bound girl who could not stand on her feet. A crazy old man with a horrified expression on his face was beating the child. He shouted at the child and explained that he was only doing it to correct her lazy nature. Time after time, the rods whistled across the unfortunate child's back, leaving deep wounds. Gadis watched the whole situation from the cliff. All the while, the girl silently guarded the fruit that reminded her of the beautiful days in the company of the ogres. Not a single sound escaped the child's lips, which infuriated the ogre man even more. His red eyes were bloodshot, for he had no intention of holding back. The loud cry of the ogre swept over the heads of the adventurers. It echoed in the sky as hundreds of wild birds flew far beyond the cliffs to warn of danger. Hearing the ferocious roar, Charlie stopped his merciless battering and looked up, silently watching the huge monster standing on the edge of the cliff. Gadis jumped down despite the rather great height. He tried to land as close as possible to these unscrupulous humans without giving them even a chance to escape. Where he stopped left indentations under his feet, and the rocks that had no place to go changed their position in space, taking a vertical position in space. The ogre's strength was so awesome that it could even be felt from a distance. His gaze screamed that he was not going to joke at this moment. Fear swept over the adventurers' minds, plunging them into darkness. It seemed to be the first time they had ever seen such a monster, from which they could hardly escape. The clothes on the child's back were torn from the old man's blows and created a red gradient from the wounds. As soon as the child turned around to see what was happening, she smiled. The girl was happy when the ogre came back for her, despite the fact that the adventurers posed some sort of danger to him. Gadis's red eyes examined the child every now and then, that she continued to hold something in her hands. Sometimes humans were even worse than the monsters that dwelt in the depths of hell. Her bleeding wounds all over her body and bruises on her face made her angry and pity the innocent child. It was unlikely she had done anything bad enough to deserve such treatment. The wizard girl shook in terror and asked her companions in her squeaky voice why the monster was following them. This time, Alfred was sure that even though it must be a mad monster, it was their duty to deal with it, and only the gray-haired old man warned them of the danger. A single blow of the ogre could be fatal for them, and it was not certain that all of them would survive it. They wanted to live, so the guy with the bandage on his head took his sword out of its sheath and with a loud shout, swung it forward. They wanted a combination attack, so he started by striking the red creature's elbow with the weapon. It seemed to Alfred that this should work, so he cheerfully asked Melfi to help him with magical support. Even though the girl was scared, she obeyed her lover because she couldn't betray the man she had been traveling with for days. He could count on her. "Fire necklace, feather mantle, deliver me from the enemy," began to mutter the sorceress, releasing a bright white light from the staff. Directing it towards the ogre, the magic gathered into a huge ball and with a flash hit the red creature right in the head. Such power should have incinerated the enemy, or at least fried him well, even if the enemy was strong. This was what the humans were counting on. They were already anticipating their victory and the huge payoff for killing the ferocious creatures. A loud sound mixed with smoke enveloped the silhouette of the monster, from which nothing could be seen within a dozen meters. However, as soon as the wind blew and pulled back the curtain, the adventurers saw Gadis, who had not even been damaged by the magical attack. He did not move even a meter, continuing to stand in one place unharmed. The girl used her strongest magic on him, but it didn't even leave a scratch. Charlie, who held the spear in his hand, shook in fear and shouted to Alfred that they should retreat immediately. When the old man's voice diverted the lad's attention, he turned around and shouted to him that he understood, but it was a huge mistake for him. The ogre came right up to him, so that you could compare their huge difference in height. Gadis gathered all his strength into a fist and directed it towards the adventurer, who had obviously miscalculated when he decided to fight him. With a single blow, the ogre sent Alfred flying several meters away, sending him flying past his surprised friends. His body was stripped of all the uniforms that were supposed to protect him in such cases, and began to lie around senselessly. The girl rushed to the aid of the lover, who mooed pitifully, holding his head. But in doing so, she also left Charlie alone in an attacking stance. Melfi shouted the guy's name over and over again, but he didn't even look at her, making it look like he was concussed. Realizing that the situation was not in their favor, the old man ordered the brat to come over to him. She naturally never listened to their commands, so she didn't even move at his words. In that case, however, the elderly adventurer himself grabbed her by the hair and pulled her ahead of him. The girl could act as bait and buy them some time, so she wasn't so useless. The old man had lived a lot in this world, but he didn't want to die, so he did what he could while the young people were sniveling. Charlie, with all the strength he had, threw the child forward as he thought to feed it to the ogre. As it flew, Gadis tried to catch the already wounded human child without damage, and while he was distracted by the girl, Charlie shouted to his own to leave. The concussed Alfred understood nothing when he was addressed, but the old man kept shaking and explaining to him that they must run before the ogre ate this child. But what was this ogre that they couldn't even manage? Charlie knew it was the same monster they'd been told about in stories since they were kids. If it went feral, with its red body and eyes burning like fire, it could turn half the Eastern Kingdom into hell. To defeat him, they would need 100 holy knights and 100 more chosen ones. That's how strong this wandering ogre is. A soul-crushing scream rang out behind the adventurers' backs, which was accompanied by an equally terrifying force. The ogre had no intention of giving them a break and would gladly turn them into a bloody mess. Holding the child with his left hand, he gathered all the power in his right and delivered a crushing blow to the humans. Red-Eye Gadis was indeed a ruthless being. All this time, Muba hesitated about what to do. Should he look for his friend who had so suddenly decided to run away? But he decided that he could not leave him alone and went in search of him. He ran around the forest constantly calling for Gadis, but heard nothing in response. The ogre continued to run around until he reached the edge of the cliff where the split boulders were lying. Curiosity got the best of him, so he knelt down and looked down at what was making so much noise. The ogre stood like a rock, carefully holding the child. He looked at the three adventurers that were crawling pitifully from side to side like earthworms. The enchantress was the most active of them, and so she tried to crawl as far away as possible from the monster that posed a threat to her life. Alfred got hit twice, but still he was able to escape, unlike Charlie, who was unconscious with a broken leg that was unnaturally twisted to the other side. Muba, from the top of the cliff, watched the unexpected situation. The bro he had been looking for so long was fighting with the humans protecting the child. The girl noticed her acquaintance, who unexpectedly also came running to her aid. She smiled radiantly as her friends became more numerous. At that moment, Gadis' apprentice and brother was already carefully climbing down the rock ledge. He was waving his hand at her, suggesting that he was coming down to help them. Melfi screamed at the top of her voice, covering her mouth with her hand as she saw another monster coming towards them. She hoped with all her heart for Alfred. The girl believed that he would definitely think of something and save her. That's why she tearfully kept asking him what to do next. Melfi begged Alfred to save her. However, when she turned back to him, she was even more amazed than when she saw the second ogre. This was a sight she had never seen before or even expected to see. The guy with the bandage on his head was sobbing, blowing snot on the ground and yelling about his own salvation. He got to his feet and staggered from side to side, running down the road to town without listening to what the sorceress was shouting at him. He had shamelessly left her and Charlie to be eaten by a ravenous monster to save his own skin. When the ogre saw how the insolent humans dared to run away from him, he screamed at the top of his voice, terrifying the creatures around him. His yell was accompanied by a concussion of the body, from which the fruit that the girl had so carefully kept jumped out of her hands. Gadis was about to catch up with them and rushed forward, rocking the child more and more in his arms. Perhaps he had even forgotten that she was in his arms. The child's eyes were filled with excitement about the apple she had struggled so hard to keep. And right now she could lose something she had worried about for so long. The child couldn't let that happen. Despite the height, she reached for the fruit, trying to catch it as quickly as possible before the apple fell and shattered. Muba, who had been standing quietly behind her the whole time, noticed the girl hanging in the air with her arms reaching forward for something, so he suddenly shouted to his friend to be careful. Scared for her life, both ogres rushed to save the child. Muba lay on the ground, guarding the girl from below, while Gadis put his other arm under the child's head. The unharmed apple was in the child's hands, and she sighed with relief and smiled with her head hanging down. It was hard to stay like that for long, so the ogre with the spikes on his shoulders put her back in his huge palm and ordered her not to do it again. She needed to become smarter and more careful, for a fall from such a height could be the last thing she would do in her life. As they talked around them, it became too quiet and empty. Only the wind rustled around, raising dust in the air. Thanks to the situation with the girl's fall, the adventurers had managed to escape even with their wounded allies unconscious. Ogre was upset that they managed to escape. However, the kind girl stroked the big man's jaw despite the pain that pinched the wounds. She was also actively waving her free hand in different directions to attract the ogre's attention. All she needed at this point was a few seconds of attention from him. The happy girl was holding a juicy red apple that shone even brighter in the sunlight. The child drew her hands forward, and since she couldn't speak, Gadis was left to guess what she wanted to say. It was hard for him to quickly understand what was going on when she kept poking the fruit in his eyes. But suddenly a memory of recent days when they were picking food in the orchard came to his mind. With his huge fingers, he had picked up an apple, which was extremely tiny for him. The girl alone was silent, quietly watching the ogre's reaction. She hoped that this appetizing gift would be to his liking. To him, the berry-sized fruit was so insignificant that it seemed impossible to distinguish the flavor. However, so as not to upset the child, he still decided to taste the food she had been watching over these past few days. Biting into the fruit, the ogre actually tried to taste it, chewing each bite carefully. He actually found it tasty. The girl's eyes shone and a smile stretched to her ears. She was glad she had managed to save it for her savior Gadis. However, the cheerful expression on her face slowly changed to a sad one. Finally, she couldn't contain her pain and bitter resentment and cried. She cuddled up to the huge ogre, who praised her for a job well done and cried at the top of her voice. Muba was also trying to cheer her up, confirming everything her friend had said. But there was no point in standing there for a long time, so they turned back towards the house, continuing their way under the crying of the child. The adventurers still managed to reach the capital of Burgundy Republic of Grelvo. There they were already discussing the recent events in which the three adventurers had encountered an ogre in the forest. However, is this really something they should be worried about? Asked the man who represented the ruling class. The priest who was standing nearby tried to explain the gist of what was happening. The thing is that according to the adventurers, the monsters attacked just to protect the slave girl. The man who was covering his face with the hood of his cloak listened to this information carefully. He thought that it was worth paying enough attention to it, because the girl could be their weak point, thanks to which people could defeat or control these monsters. Meanwhile, Muba and Gadis returned to their base with the baby in their arms, where Mizary was already running around with a cauldron in her hands. This is definitely something people should look into. Several days had passed since that terrible moment. The ogres continued to go to the forest to pick sweet fruits. However, the hole in the child's clothes grew wider each time, sliding down his back, so the next time Gadis and his company went to meet a wandering merchant. Gathering up all the armor the adventurers had tossed the ogre, laid it out on the floor of the building where they had placed the man. Each piece, no matter the type, Darroch could take for himself by paying a reasonable sum. The man rubbed his hands together, looking at the fine assortment he was being offered. He would gladly take anything that didn't lay right. While the merchant was looking at the swords, he was also offering his other services, such as selling various seasonings and herbs. How fortunate at this point, for Gadis needed both of those things, including the medicines. The ogre stood quietly behind him, while the lowly merchant tried to squeeze each item he bought into his bag, which seemed to have no bottom at all. To him, these monsters were just a bunch of idiots who bought his stuff for whatever price he would name. His smirk popped up on his face, each time showing the nasty nature of the creature. Gadis, who was quietly watching him, asked him to wait a few minutes, as he needed one more thing. To this, the good-natured merchant happily agreed. The more they needed, the richer his wallet. However, he was still annoyed by the fact that at the end of the transaction, he was told about some more purchases. Returning as quickly as possible, the ogre politely apologized for the wait. Looking behind his back, Gadis introduced the man to a traveling merchant named Darroch. Awkwardly peeking out from behind the monster, the child looked at his new acquaintance. The awkward expression changed to a welcoming one, and the girl gathered her fists together and bowed to the merchant. Gadis stroked the child's head with his index finger, for this was the first time he had been able to see how people presented themselves to others. The girl's sweetness charmed Darroch, making it seem as if he was about to glow with kindness himself. Pushing the child forward, the ogre asked the merchant if there were any clothes for such a small creature, but the merchant did not seem to be listening. It was only when he repeated his request that Darroch apologized for being distracted. Confused, he asked again about the clothes, and began rummaging through his bottomless bags for what he needed. He had a pile of this type of clothing, but to avoid going through each set, Darroch asked what exactly they were looking for. Ogre also had no idea what would be best for the little girl, so he addressed her directly. For the first time ever, she was given the right to make the choice herself. With such joy, the child began to jump in all directions, waving her arms left and right, mimicking the movements of a brave knight. She tried her best to show what she wanted, but none of them understood her wishes. Darok then offered her another option, let her change her clothes and see what suited her best, and then decide what to buy. Going through her belongings, the merchant offered to start by taking off her dirty clothes, and then they would help her get dressed. However, this arrangement did not please Mizary, who had been standing in the doorway for some time now, listening to their conversation. She squinted one eye and said a phrase she'd heard recently from the humans. "It seems that such guys who offer to undress people they don't know are called perverts," she suggested. Frightened, they immediately began to refuse to listen, because Mizary had gotten it all wrong. However, she wasn't going to listen to them and replied that she was going to pick out her child's clothes herself. After all, it was originally necessary to ask her for help. "Just leave it to me," she said, and took the girl behind a makeshift screen. She dressed her in various outfits. Some modest dresses had a cape over the head, some were flaunted with ruffles decorated with delicate patterns, and others attracted attention with a huge number of bows on the head and back. The ogre woman was clearly getting into the excitement of picking up more and more options for the girl to try on. Even the merchant hadn't expected her to act so feminine, and only Gadis begged Muba to do something to stop their friend. However, the next outfit appealed more to the girl. It was just above knee length, a solid color dress with red trim around the edges. It was not so massive, easy to put on, and just as easy to wash. She liked clothes like this better. Mizary kept yelling that it was too simple, but no one listened to her anymore. The child was fine with these clothes, so Gadis advised her to just leave it as it was. Meanwhile, Darok approached the girl and complimented her, calling her pretty. She was well looked after all. But upon hearing the merchant's words, the ogre turned around and shouted that they didn't care about anyone, and it was all nonsense. Muba and Mizary stood silent, wondering when their friend would admit to himself that he cared for the child. Even Darok wondered why they kept this man around. The ogre's face became scarier than death itself, instilling fear in his companion. "She's backup power," the ogre said angrily, continuing to stare at the merchant. The merchant himself began to pale, not expecting such an answer, because the child was nice and kind enough to be eaten. However, that is the nature of the ogres. They are a vile race that does not shed tears. It was natural for them to treat this human as food. The reason she wore those ragged clothes was probably because they forced her to work tirelessly for them. While Darok speculated about the bloodthirstiness of the monsters, the ogres themselves noticed that they were looking at them strangely, but Mizary offered to ignore the nonsense. The first-time wandering merchant would like to go home soon and forget about this situation. Meanwhile, the town square was buzzing with all sorts of conversations about the hunt, so there was no silence in the city for a few days. Knights and adventurers were yelling at the top of their voices about hunting monsters in the mountains. They were all screaming for a place for every creature that dared to hurt their much-loved Alfred. Everyone was assembling a team to divinely punish the ruthless beast. Walking past all these people, Darok realized that those were no different in their stupidity than the ogres. Gadis's power was unrivaled. Some backwater town wouldn't stand a chance against him. All the while he was on his way home, he was followed by a hooded man familiar to us. In his humble opinion, these men could hardly hope to defeat that ogre. He was willing to bet that they were just trying to show off for the family of that spoiled brat, who had barely returned from fighting the monster. People were just hoping for a bonus, but none of them had actually tried to fight for real. Darok hadn't expected someone to talk to him in such an impassable alley, so he was a little surprised. The man continued to address him, for with his help, people could defeat the monsters. The stranger squinted his eyes and introduced himself. His name was Wolfgang, and he was a former royal court mage. The hooded guy knew that no one would refuse him, so he asked for a favor. But why was he so sure of himself? If Darok had done them a favor, they would have had a better chance of defeating the red-eyed Gadis, the hooded man kept saying. But the traveling merchant stubbornly pretended not to know who he was talking about, saying that he had never met anyone by that name in his life. Wolfgang asked for forgiveness as politely as possible, but the sarcasm in his voice was still there. He had been told in advance that the merchant was dealing with monsters, but since that was the case, then he still shouldn't interfere in the affairs of a human-demon hybrid like the merchant. However, smilingly, he promised to keep his secret. Only one thing was clear from this conversation: he was threatening Darok. Rubbing his hands together with excitement, the man asked what he wanted from him, because the merchant was extremely weak and hardly able to help people during the hunt. For the former mage only needed a little help from the merchant, which he had asked for earlier. Their Republic of Grelvo has received an official military order to hunt the red-eyed Gadis, explained the guy in the robe, putting his arm out to the side, giving a place to land to the owl that had just appeared. However, the traveling merchant didn't understand what this had to do with him. So to keep the conversation going, he replied that it was indeed an unpleasant event. But that was not all Wolfgang wanted to inform him about. With the previous information, they were also informed that the orcs had taken a human child, and in order to give their best in this horrible massacre, they needed to save that poor child. Taking out from his pocket a pouch with the emblem of the letter M, Wolfgang asked Darok to open the bag after the girl moves away from the ogre. That's when the mage would use his power to get her to safety. While the humans agreed to cooperate in the war, the ogres were busy trying to get food for the day. The big, furry bear rushed from side to side in terror, avoiding the hands of the monsters that surrounded him. Muba shouted that he had cornered him, to which Gadis begged him not to let him go, for they needed food today. The little girl that had gone hunting with them, at the ogre's request, hid behind a nearby rock and watched their movements. The child bravely swung her fists as if she herself was in a battle with a huge, furry creature. She was not even embarrassed by the blood spatter when Muba hit the animal on the head, crushing its skull. It seemed that this picture even encouraged her, making the stars in her eyes shine brighter. However, the next conversation she had with him calmed her perky disposition, forcing her to step back a bit. They were going to butcher the bear on the spot, and were already dividing up the entrails. Some wanted its organs, and some wanted to taste its brain. To them, the blood-soaked body only seemed to smell more delicious. The freshest parts were the best. Fresh scarlet liquid flowed down their arms, and when Gadis remembered the child, he offered her a snack. Muba, meanwhile, was contentedly digging his hands deeper and deeper into the warm body of the beast. It was not a pleasant sight for a human child who was disgusted by the sight of blood. Remembering the leather sack, Gadis asked the girl to rinse it with water, and the rest they were ready to deal with. The ogre's subordinate was also asked to rinse her eyeballs, but the child was already rushing with all her might to the river before she was forced to do something else disgusting. The river was not far away, and it was easy to get there. Passing by a large number of bushes, she heard the murmuring of water at the sound of which she ran. Leaning over to the source of the water, she began to draw it into a pouch, letting it out from time to time. When she heard someone's voice, she looked up and looked away from her work. Beautiful music flowed along the movement of the water, making her listen to the beautiful voice. Walking a little to the side, she came upon a beautiful creature that was sitting on a green plant petal, clasping its hands to its chest and making beautiful singing sounds. The child smiled as she watched the performance of the forest fairy that tried so hard to sing beautifully. Even the little creature itself had not expected to see a human child in this forest. It was a rare good fortune. She beckoned the girl to her with her honeyed voice, wondering if it was the song that had brought the child to her. It was Lianan Sid, a fairy who wears a yellow robe and seduces humans. All of her lovers, by all accounts, were gifted with a talent for the arts and had a beautiful singing voice. The fairy flew thanks to her beautiful wings. She was impressed that the child was able to understand her marvelous voice, so she thought the girl deserved her praise. However, it was time to end it. The creature with wings brazenly extended its palm towards the confused child. Since it liked her voice, it was time to pay for her presence at her performance. She didn't understand why the human child stood there and just stared at her, but when she noticed the collar around her neck, she knew immediately. The child was a slave, and since the girl belonged to that class of people, she couldn't ask the magical creature for anything. Lianan was upset that she had found such a poor person. For once, she had been able to organize a wonderful feast, but now she could not count on it. The girl listened attentively the whole time, but when she heard the word feast, she slapped her chest, telling the winged creature that she could count on her. Taking a leather bag with water, the girl, under the shouts of the fairy, ran back to the ogres. It was incredible. It was probably the first time the singer hadn't been paid for her concert. Settling back on a plant leaf, the creature folded its wings and chose not to focus on the situation. The carefree Lianan had fallen asleep in a short period of time, snoring loudly and drooling on her cheeks. She must have been dreaming of something delicious. While she was asleep, the child managed to quickly return and quietly sneak up on the fairy. When the beautiful creature woke up, something delicious would be waiting for her, because the girl had so carefully brought and left a part of the brain and eyes of the bear on a big stump. As it happened, the silence of the forest was interrupted by a loud female cry that could be heard all around. She must have enjoyed it so much that she was screaming with pleasure, thought the girl as she went home with the ogres, dragging the meat and skin of her prey on her back. Mizary waited a long time for her friends from the hunt, but when she saw that they had caught the bear, she praised them for a job well done. Holding the bear's appetizing leg in her hand, she said that she should have gone along with them. Gadis, however, waved her off and replied that someone had gotten the best part, alluding to the fairy. The girl wandered around the circle, looking at the ogres without emotion until a familiar voice called out to them. At the entrance to their base stood a wandering merchant who said a modest hello to the red creatures. The ogre asked Darroch how Darroch had decided to visit them again, to which the man replied that he had just been in the neighborhood and decided to stop by. The girl was happy to see her new friend, but didn't know that there were strangers watching her besides him. Having a magic ball, Wolfgang watched them. He was surprised to see the girl safe and sound. The boy didn't know what had caused this, but those pesky ogres were clearly in their way. Watching the girl through the orb, the ruling man asked the mage if he was sure of what he said. There was no doubt, however. Wolfgang convinced him that this foolish half-demon merchant had agreed to separate the girl and the ogres. The beast that was in the darkness viciously awaited its glittering release to tear its victim apart. As soon as Darroch fulfilled the promised part of the plan, the wizard would immediately spring into action and finish her off. Meanwhile, in the ogre village, the cauldron of food was boiling, spreading the odor throughout the area. The dinner the ogres could not wait for was almost ready. Mizary, who was preparing it, called the traveling merchant over to keep an eye on him while she stepped away. A normal person would have just poured it out and buried it as deep as possible. It smelled exactly like it looked. Disgusting. They just put the meat, vegetables, and salt in one giant pot. The broth, of course, was never strained, so the simmering fat on the surface added to the putrid appearance, the stench of which didn't bother anyone. Well, it was an ogre's dinner after all. The girl, who had been waiting patiently in the house as soon as she heard the cooking was finished, grabbed a wooden bowl of utensils and ran over to Darroch. Without much trouble, she dipped her spoon into the wok and began scooping the food past the huge chunks of meat and bones. The merchant was clearly surprised that she wasn't confused by the smell or the sight of the dish. Perhaps it was all from hunger, the man thought. However, her behavior was just to his advantage. Without realizing it, she was starting to put the ogres out of their game. The sooner they ate, the sooner he would leave their lair. Not wasting such an opportunity, Darroch pulled his bag of belongings towards him. After rummaging through them for a while, he found what he was looking for. In his meals, he always used some ingredients that were not available to the monsters. That was a spice mixture. It was quite expensive, so it had to be used with caution. The spices took away the foul odor, so even Gadis noticed it and said that the dinner had a pleasant appearance. With the 5 of them gathered in a circle, the girl began pouring dinner into bowls that the monsters served her. As soon as the first bowl was filled, she gave her savior her first treat. He politely thanked the child and began to taste the food, which added new spices. After eating about half a bowl, Gadis complimented Mizary on how her cooking was getting better each time. At this, the embarrassed female ogre blushed and called the man a fool with a little stammer. Even if he praised her every time, he wouldn't get more food out of it. However, Gadis just wanted to be honest and said what came to mind. Muba, who had been sitting smiling the whole time, licked his spoon and turned to the merchant to say that the food was really good and asked for at least a little bit of their food. However, Darroch was not going to refuse their offer, but before that, he had something special for all of them. A dozen, if not more, clay vessels with several liters of liquid in them appeared in front of the ogres at the same moment. When the ogres saw what they had been presented with, they all pounced on the drink, shouting, "Drink!" It was clear that they had not seen firewater in a long time. Everyone flattered Darroch by calling him the best. They thanked him for such a gift and for coming into their lives. Everyone poured in the liquid as if it were their last chance to try it. No one even noticed that the traveling peddler didn't drink or eat anything. Even the girl felt perfectly safe and ate leisurely, chilling spoonful after spoonful of food. She really enjoyed her dinner in the company of friends she could trust, so she quietly enjoyed the food and the loud conversations of the ogres. Darroch, who sat beside Gadis, was watching the human children surreptitiously. Turning to the ogre, the man still dared to ask where they got this child from. She just had fine manners, so he was interested, the merchant replied. But that didn't matter to Gadis. He had no idea who she belonged to or who she had been before. Over the long conversations, the night came quickly, making the warm wind ripple the leafy green foliage. All the booze had been destroyed, the fire had died down, and the ogres were enjoying a peaceful sleep with occasional snores. The only house that was more or less habitable was the only one that attracted attention. Gadis slept soldered on a bed that had once been made by a child. There was more than enough room, however, so that even the girl could fit in beside him, no matter how he lay. She dreamed of the horrors of recent days. A horseless carriage stood in the woods with its doors ajar. The 2 men next to it were quietly discussing something. The older man, who looked richer, was asking the other if he had left the apples that attracted the monsters. However, everything was done properly. Nevertheless, the interlocutor was not sure if the idea of leaving the little slave girl in a forest that was swarming with goblins was a good idea. However, the older man asked him to be quiet. Repeating the plan, he reminded his companion that they had just been attacked by monsters on this route, which was the reason why they were actually forced to leave the crew. The child was to be destroyed without regret. She was the daughter of a diabolical woman, and if not for the rules, she would have been beaten to death long ago. Unfortunately, all these nasty words the child clearly heard sitting in the empty carriage. But now she didn't care. She would be killed anyway. Opening the door, the stranger turned to the girl saying that everything was all right. She had a short life, but if she wanted to curse someone, let it be her parents. The monsters here will make sure she goes to heaven, the man who brought her to this place kept saying. As time passed, the neighborhood became quiet. The child with shackles on her legs was looking at the apples that acted as bait. Looking out the small window, she was able to watch the movement of the sky where the moon was gradually shifting sideways. The cold night was followed by a hot day. The rays of the sun continued to shine through the window into the wagon with the child. Though she was hungry, she did not take any apples from the crate that stood beside her. Why should she, if she was about to be eaten? As if anticipating this, a menacing roar was heard in the neighborhood, scaring away the animals all around. The exhausted child had been waiting for her death for some time, so she simply raised her head to look at the guest. The girl sat quietly in the corner while someone was talking behind the walls. A gruff voice asked Muba to shut up, for their business would only get worse if they scared people. However, another voice asked for forgiveness, except he hadn't seen a single person up to that point. Although there was no one nearby, but a faint odor could still be smelled, so one of them decided to check every corner. Opening the door, two red hands began to make their way deep inside the wagon to peek inside. Waking up on the soft bed, the girl blinked a couple times, trying to figure out if this was reality or a dream. Everything was still the same. The huge ogre was still snoring after a big drink. Looking at the relaxed savior, the girl could not believe her happiness. It was just a dream after all. The scariest dream in her short life. The moment she awoke, Darroch beckoned the little girl to him. It was as if he had been waiting for the moment to call her to him. Standing in the doorway, the polite merchant asked the child to show him the way to the river. The girl naturally agreed, not realizing that she would regret it later. Halfway to the reservoir, the peddler grabbed the girl under her arm and ran deep into the forest. The owl, who was watching this, acted as a magical beast, through which Wolfgang was able to quietly observe the half-demon who was doing his job perfectly. Darroch managed to steal the daughter of the queen of the fallen kingdom, Princess Titania. Darroch had lived as a half-demon for as long as he could remember, not knowing who his real parents were. Although he was actually a mixture of demon and human, he wasn't particularly strong or intelligent, so the people around him mostly avoided him. The man had advanced far enough despite his lack of connections or any other chances. Wolfgang promised Darroch that he would introduce him to the aristocrats if he could handle the mission he was given. Then he might even have his own store. Running further and further through the forest, the wandering merchant could already feel himself beginning to see the light in his bleak life. Putting the child on her feet, the man muttered to himself if they had run far enough. He asked the girl not to resist, for she should be free of the monster's shackles in no time. There was not much left to her freedom. He was convinced that as soon as he opened the bag with the mark, good people would join them and take them away. Then there would be nothing more to worry about. With luck, perhaps the child could even start working in his store. Darroch was blinded by the hooded boy's promises, dreaming of what he didn't have on his hands. Once they were in the open clearing, he was about to open the pouch, but upon seeing it, the girl lunged at him with all her might. She could not allow it to be opened. She knocked out the ominous bag with an unknown filling, which rolled on the ground, causing the man to shout at the child. Darroch was angry because he clearly asked her to sit still, but she wouldn't listen to him. However, when he looked at the ground, he was silent. A black liquid began to gurgle out of the pouch. No one understood what it was, so they just stood silently watching her further actions. The black liquid looked more and more like boiling tar and increased in size furiously. The bubbles, on the other hand, were rising upward, taking on a different shape. Each bubble bursting created several new ones, making the effects irreversible. Now before them stood a devilish wolf-like creature that was blacker than night. Growling menacingly, it came closer and closer to the child, near which the merchant himself stood, not understanding anything. This must be the boss's acquaintance that Wolfgang was talking about, Darroch said, smiling. Still, magic was a pretty amazing thing. Turning to the little girl, he told her that this dog would get her to safety. This time, however, he was more wrong than ever. The creature's jaws clamped down harder, each time creating loud, snarling sounds. In an instant, the dog-like creature lunged with all its might towards the wandering merchant. If not for the intelligence of a human child, perhaps the man would have never been able to speak to customers again. But despite the fact that he had stolen her, the girl was determined to save her captor. The wolf flew past the two men, stopping where the men had just been standing. Darroch himself and the child ended up near that bag and the M-tag. The wandering peddler was in complete shock. He was trying to realize what kind of situation he was lucky enough to be in. The man was dazzled by the promised riches, which made it easy to deceive him. Wolfgang said that an acquaintance from the bag would take the child to a safe place and introduce him to the aristocrat. However, wasn't that too convenient and easy? Without realizing it himself, by some miracle, he believed the stranger with his dubious offer. However, scrolling back to the day of their first meeting, he remembered the glint in the hooded guy's eyes that made him trust him. An owl that sat on the branch of one of the trees grudgingly hooted. Wolfgang's hypnosis had stopped, which he had not expected. However, even such a worthless demon could get him this far even without a magic item. Looking at the girl, Darroch didn't understand why that guy was after her in the first place. He didn't see any value in the child for himself, so he decided to abandon her and just try to run away. He was convinced it was just a basic survival instinct. The little girl was angry with him herself, but that didn't make her any less afraid. Even getting up from the ground, she shook like an aspen leaf in the wind, swaying from side to side. Watching this picture, the man felt sorry for the child, yet he was kinder than some people. That's why he grabbed the child by the shoulder and told her to run to Gadis. The girl didn't want to listen to him and leave him alone, but when he shouted to run to her right away, she perked up and moved a couple of meters away. Though she could be a strategic food supply for the ogres, it would be safer to stay with them than here. The merchant wanted her to live at least a few more days and blocked the wolf's path to the fleeing little girl. The blame for his deception rested entirely on Darroch. Even if it cost him his life, he would buy time for her to escape. As the merchant had ordered, the child ran as fast as she could despite the branches whipping her face painfully. When she reached a small slope, she tried to jump over it at full speed for there was water below. But as she landed on the other side, she slipped her smooth shoes on the wet grass and fell backwards. The squelch of the water was heard throughout the neighborhood, causing waves to rise on the surface of the river. Emerging from the water, the girl breathed tiredly, constantly looking ahead. After she was seen, a high female voice was heard that cried out, "So it's you?" The forest fairy that had been quietly sleeping until now was irritably pointing her finger at the little girl. And it was all because the human child had left her that disgusting eyeball brain last time. The sight and stench of those foods had ruined Lianen's day, so she'd specifically voiced her displeasure to the rude creature. The fairy threatened that she would never forgive her child for this, but the girl calmly got up from the water and tried to gesture to calm her down. The girl tried to force her to be silent, pushing her away from her. Seeing that Lin and Side had calmed down a bit, the child tried to run away, squelching her feet in the river, but the fairy again began to resent the fact that now they were trying to get away from her. The girl carried on past the trees, occasionally clinging to the branches with her hair. All the time she was running, the girl turned back hoping that no one was chasing her. With a loud sigh, she stopped to catch her breath. Still, Linen went with the girl, thinking she was safe. She was now skulking in the waistband of the child's dress, who didn't even notice the fairy who was pleased with this state of affairs. She would definitely take her straight to her master's settlement, and once they got there, Linen could tell him anything he wanted. Meanwhile, Darroch was able to retrieve the weapon he carried for self-defense. He would need it more than once this time. The wolf ran at him in spite of his fear of death. But did he have one? Pointing the barrel at the wild creature, the wandering merchant ordered it to come closer out of fear, for it should not be underestimated. Wolfgang continued to watch his pet fight while the girl carried on toward the ogre settlement, where Gadis slept peacefully unaware of the terrible events. The beast stood directly in front of Darroch, teeth bared. Saliva dripped from its huge mouth, dripping onto the ground and leaving a wet trail. The wandering merchant wondered to the creature if he wanted to abandon his efforts and give up the little girl. However, this only made the wolf angrier, causing it to growl louder and louder at its opponent. Only the owl, who was sitting alone in a tree, silently watched the situation. Through it, the two men were constantly watching them, worrying about their own plan, which they had been thinking over for days. The ruling man asked Wolfgang if it would really work, but what was happening left him no other choice. The hooded guy wouldn't want to use it, but the situation demanded to reveal all the trump cards. If only Darroch died along with that girl, everyone else would be able to live another day. At that moment, the pouch that was behind the beast began to move, lifting the edges of the neck. Gurgling loudly, the black liquid quickly crawled out of its hole, transforming into a monster of unfathomable proportions. The girl continued to run forward. The way was not close and therefore required a lot of time to overcome it. Her legs seemed to carry her. However, she barely moved them, swaying in different directions. Her body could collapse at any moment, as it had been shaking for a long time, and her lungs were burning. Oxygen was not getting to her brain in time, and it seemed that the baby was about to collapse. Stopping to take a break, the girl gulped down cold air in large portions, saturating her blood with oxygen. At the same moment, the fairy, for the first time for the whole journey, gave her voice, asking when they would get to her master. The child was electrocuted. Her eyes became the size of coins, and her mouth opened in mute question. Linen, amazed at the little girl's stupidity, laughed with her hand covering her mouth. She only now noticed that the fairy had followed her. But she laughed and called the child good, for she was sure the girl would make the right choice and take her to her master. Looking around, the little girl began to think about what to do with the uninvited guest. It was dangerous to take it with her, but if she left it, it would raise a ruckus. But having made a choice, she decided to chase the fairy away. She was about to pull it out of her belt, but it kept screaming and asking her to stop. Linen wondered why the human child was so stubborn to take the fairy to her master. If she is so adamant, then she must have a reason for not letting her meet him. An idea popped into the magical creature's mind, so she was willing to bet the child that her owner was really a good person. The girl did not immediately understand why such a question, so she kept silent for a long time. But the stubborn fairy continued to ask strange questions, the first of which was to clarify whether it was a tall man. Here it was not even necessary to lie, because any ogre is taller than a man. When asked if he was rich, the child nodded reluctantly, because she didn't know if the armor and trade with Daruk could be considered wealth. But when asked about his strength, the child nodded her head without delay. All the points fit the fairy's parameters, which she used to define an ideal man. Such a chance could not be missed, so turning into a human-sized body, Linen picked up the baby and flew into the sky. The girl was thrilled with the sensation of flying, so she flung her arms out to the side. At least now there was no need to run, and there was time to enjoy the pastime. The magical creature was just asking to be shown the way. Usually she only took this form when she was trying to seduce a man, but this time was different. So she just expected the child to keep her end of the bargain. Pointing her finger the way the little girl led her to the ogre base, where Gadis was thrashing around in different directions. Trying to land neatly, Lean and Sithhi cheerfully greeted the occupants of such a small settlement, constantly asking if anyone was home. After all, she was such a wonderful girl for bringing a lost child. Gadis was running around constantly yelling that the girl had run away, so he woke everyone he could. A sleepy Mizary wiped her eyes and asked him not to yell, but he couldn't calm down because the child was nowhere to be found. Muba then looked up and asked his friend to look up there as well. Under the branches of the tree there was a girl, waving her arms in the air, and in a moment she would have fallen to the ground, for the fairy was frightened by the scream and lost consciousness herself. Gadis reached up in time and grabbed the human child, asking what she was doing there. Mizary, who was nearby, was more interested not in how she had gotten there, but how she had gotten so many scratches on her body. Since she couldn't speak, she was just going to gesture. But noticing Lenin lying in the grass, she rushed over to her. When she was frightened by the scream, she habitually took her small form, and since she was unconscious, she could not even testify. Since the child had been found, Gadis, remembering how he had been running around a while ago, felt it necessary to clarify some details. Namely that the only reason he was worried was because he didn't want to lose the spare food, not because he was worried about her. All of his friends were used to his antics like this and just accepted it. Meanwhile, the child approached Gadis and tugged a few times on his clothes, getting his attention. Ruffling her hair on her head, the girl moved her lips like a fish, making some sounds. The ogres immediately realized that the girl was referring to Daruk, whom they really hadn't seen since they woke up. The little girl restlessly continued to tug at Gadis's clothes, pointing her finger deep into the forest. It was clear she was calling after her, so Muba assumed something had happened to the wandering merchant. Gathering all together, they set off in search of the poor fellow. Naturally, the whole gang was led by a human child pointing out the place where they had split up. About halfway through, Mizary wondered why they were even looking for him. Gadis replied that next time he would repay them with a drink. Walking forward some more distance, the child began to recognize the rocks behind which they were hiding from the dog. Seeing Daruk peeking out from behind the mountain, the girl was determined to run to him. She was glad that the merchant was unharmed, for she now owed him her life. Standing behind the little girl, Gadis shouted to the merchant, asking what he was doing there while the girl ran forward. In an instant, however, the girl's face changed. She was now terrified. The night was distorting the perception of the eye, and what had recently seemed normal, coming closer turned out to be a horrifying sight. From behind the mountain, a huge paw began to emerge and pierce the man with its claw. Something was using him as bait. Brave Alfred raised his hand in the air and replied that it was a matter of course. For love, justice, and peace, they had to destroy those monsters. Instead of the expected wolf that was smaller than the ogres, there was now a huge creature that looked like a mighty dragon. Leonansida is a beautiful magical creature with long hair and a beautiful dress. People often referred to her as a fairy mistress. While running around with a rough human child, she ran into a group of ogres and passed out. And now that she had regained consciousness, an indescribable sight was revealed before her. She was caught up in a battle between giant monsters. She didn't want to stay between them for a moment. Screaming at the top of her voice, the fairy behind the child's belt ordered her to hurry up and run away, because she had promised to introduce her to her beautiful master. But instead, they were here. This much noise Mizary was not going to tolerate. Turning to the magical creature, she barked at it and told it to shut up. In fact, she didn't even know who she was or what she was even doing in this place. To this, Leonan yelled back and ordered Mizary not to get cocky just because she was an ogre. Turning to the child, Mizary told the little girl to put that thing away, to which the fairy responded by insulting the ogre woman. As they argued, the huge paw released its claws and lunged forward to harm the child. Mizary, on the other hand, was always at the ready. Her quick reactions were as fast as her friends. As soon as she heard the sound of something cutting through the air, she rushed forward. Whether it was on automatic or to protect the human child, Mizary covered both her and the fairy, scaring them both. The huge claws hit her right shoulder, but thanks to that, they didn't hit the girl. Gadis, who was at a loss, only noticed something rushing past him at a great speed. It was Mizary who took the hit, and due to the huge difference in mass flew off in the opposite direction. Seeing that it was his friend, he asked if she was all right. However, the fairy did not relent, and ordered her to run away as fast as possible. However, Mizary was not the type of person who would cowardly run away from some reptiles. Standing up, Mizary held her arm. It seemed that that blow had torn not only her top, but also the muscles in her arm. She screamed at her opponent, calling him a damn overgrown lizard, and beckoning him to come closer. Only Leonan, fearing for her precious hide, sobbed and ordered her not to provoke the monster. The dragon, which had been standing still for some time, screamed at the top of its voice, waving its tail in anger. Rushing at the child, the dragon roared along with the frightened fairy that did not want to see her death closed her eyes. However, he was not allowed to attack. Grabbing the same tail, two huge hands squeezed a few scales, tearing them from the place where they grew. Gadis, who was behind his foe, used all available force to strike as effectively as possible. As soon as he tensed the muscles of his back, he pulled the dragon towards him, thus lifting it into the air and literally put the lizard on its shoulder blades. Not expecting such a blow, the creature roared loudly as its back hit the ground, shattering the landscape of the clearing. It seemed to be immobilized forever. The dragon did not even move for a long time without giving any signs of life. Opening her eyes, Leonan assessed the situation and turned to Mizary, praising her lover for not being so bad. However, Mizary, starting to blush, awkwardly corrected her by saying that he was not her lover. It was just a rotten bond she couldn't break. Hearing the girls talk, Gadis asked her what she meant, and maybe he would have gotten an answer if it wasn't for that dog that appeared as if out of nowhere, continuing to run in their direction. As soon as the ogre shouted her name, Mizary turned her head toward the sound that continued to intensify. The creature was purposefully running at the child without reacting to the others to kill her. The ogre woman put up her left hand, which the wolf immediately grabbed. As soon as the hand was in its mouth, there was the sound of tearing muscle flesh that was cut by the beast's long fangs. The wounded Mizary was no match for it, however, only standing up to her full height and waving her hand in different directions, trying to throw the wolf off of her. A bite from some mutt would have been no good to her. She had more adrenaline in her blood than normal, so she didn't seem to feel any pain. The whole time she moved her arm, a smile could be seen on her face. At some point she managed to throw the enemy off, causing the wolf to fall to the ground with a whimper. Turning back to Gadis, Mizary asked her to ignore them. She could protect the little girl herself, but his job was to deal with the dragon. Agreeing with Mizary, he was ready for battle, and as soon as Muba asked him to turn around, he saw something. The overgrown lizard was rising to its paws like nothing had happened. It seemed the blow that had made it lie down was some sort of rest. Not a single scratch was visible on the dragon's body. Straightening up to its full height, the creature spread its wings in different directions, screaming loudly into the air. Stepping forward, the brave Gadis, for the protection of his gang, ordered the dragon to come at him. The girl sat calmly cradling the fairy against her, her palm acting as a shield. Mizary, on the other hand, with the only hand that listened to her, was pinning the still living wolf to the ground. Both the dragon and the giant wolf were only aimed at the little girl. Whatever situation was going on right now, but Linen continued to howl. She didn't want to participate in this circus at all, so she begged at least someone to save her. At this time, an angry dragon lifted Darok off the ground and threw him forward straight into the hands of the ogres. Gadis, with cries of worry, tried to catch the wandering merchant constantly calling his name. There wasn't much time to do so, however. Muba, who was always looking ahead, called out to his brother, standing in front of him. Muba shielded his friend from the lizard's direct attack, which was causing a lot of trouble. 3 huge claws went all over Muba's body, causing blood to spurt in all directions. Mizary wanted to rush to his aid, but it was unlikely that she would have had time to do so, as the dragon was lightning fast. Angry for his friend, Gadis rushed forward to stand in front of the cold-blooded beast. He felt that the enemy had no right to hurt his friend, so he wanted to grab his tail again. However, Gadis immediately found himself lying down. The dragon swung his tail with great force at the ogre, pinning him to the cold ground. When the dragon lifted his tail off the ogre, everyone saw the amount of blood that belonged to their friend. With one of its front paws on Gadis, the overgrown lizard tensed its claws so he couldn't escape. Now Mizary and the child were in danger. The only one who could stop the enemy was Gadis, and now he lay immobilized. Thus the human child became an easy target for the dragon. The creature turned its head sharply toward the girl. The shaggy mane on the monster's head developed playfully in different directions at the slightest movement. The cornered child shook in fear, while Mizary, with one functioning arm, held the magical wolf. The terrifying creature was slowly but surely approaching them. Its huge paw left behind more and more ruined earth with each step. No one else was capable of facing such an enemy. They were trapped in a trap of their own making. Mizary, though she didn't show it, was also terrified. She shouted Gadis's name loudly, calling out to him repeatedly. The ogre woman didn't know why these creatures were targeting the little girl, but she asked her friend to do something about it. The fairy, who had done nothing during the fight and was just hiding, started yelling that in that case she should have just sacrificed the baby and fled. If the little girl managed to piss off the wolf and the dragon, she probably deserved it. That was the verdict the cruel Linen announced. Everyone in the neighborhood fell silent. Mizary, gritting her teeth, pondered how to avoid the worst outcome. Darok, on the other hand, lay on the ground trembling from the mutilation, the pain of which shook every cell in his body. At the same time, Muba lay covered in blood between the rocks near the forest. Still, he had suffered a great deal when he had rescued his brother. And only Gadis was held captive by one of the paws of a huge lizard that was blocking out all light. It would have been impossible to escape. The dragon was taller than the trees here. Even the owl had to fly higher to be at eye level with him. The little one understood perfectly well. Looking up at the monster that had defeated all the strong ogres, she regretted being with them. She was the reason her friends were injured. Gadis had once saved her, and instead of thanking the ogre in return, she had only put him in danger and brought trouble to them. The child blamed herself, though she knew full well she had done nothing wrong. Bowing her head, her gaze faded and stared at the ground. Seeing her expression, the fairy realized that the child had made a decision, so she advised her to boldly walk forward and obediently let herself be eaten. However, her friendly advice was interrupted by Mizary, who menacingly barked at her to shut up. This shout not only surprised Linen, but also shook the child's clouded mind. Thanks to the nonsense that the forest creature had advised, Mizary finally came to her senses. When she finished addressing the fairy, she turned forward and shouted to Gadis to get up. It had taken him long enough, but the sun was still high, so there was business to be done. Rising from his knees, the strongest of the ogres let steam out of his nose from the anger that had built up. He didn't care who he was dealing with, and was ready to fight to the last man, especially those who were getting their hands on his things. The owl that flew over the dragon's head gave a disgruntled hoot, and the creature turned its head in the direction of the noise Gadis was making. Wolfgang had not expected such an unpleasant turn of events. He could not let it gain more power, so he gave orders to kill the ogre immediately and then return to the girl. Gadis tensed his body as the overgrown lizard roared, telling him to get ready for a serious battle. Pointing its head down and opening its jaws, the dragon rushed forward to bite the defender in two. Gadis reacted instantly to his enemy's attack and parried his blow with a sharp movement of his arm. The palm of his hand hit the dragon's lower jaw, pushing it farther away. With the next movement of his hand, he hit the reptile's rib cage, causing it to wheeze in pain. The girls rejoiced at their friend's success. Now the child was under reliable protection, because in a furious state Gadis was hard to stop. But while the ogre was fighting one enemy with all his strength, the other one, having also accepted the order to kill Gadis, began to act. The dog broke free from Mizary's relaxed grip, causing her to shriek in surprise. Linen tearfully waved her arms from side to side, shouting at Mizary to tame these monsters instead of catching crows. The dog lunged towards the little girl with its mouth wide open for a bite. The girl instantly reacted to this movement by jumping back in the opposite direction of her attacker. However, the creature managed to sink its fangs into one of the little girl's legs. That hurt. Lying on her stomach, the human child watched with fear and tears in her eyes as the dog bit into her legs. All of this was accompanied by Linen Anand's screams of outrage, mauling it close. The child's gaze was fixed only on the dark fur of the beast that blocked the view of Gadis's fight. However, as she trembled with fear watching the enemy, she noticed an object sticking out of the beast's withers. She had seen the court mage Wolfgang come to her parents' house and show her this object, which looked like a bullet with engraved notches. Then he would bring reports of his most recent research. If one were to strike with this engraved magic tool, it was possible to bend the enemy to one's will. This could be used in the affairs of the army, for public affairs, or on envoys. The king and queen listened attentively to everything the magician expounded. Even the little princess, modestly peeking out from behind her mother's dress, watched Wolfgang. However, the queen did not wish to see such objects in front of her. To her, he was only a fool. With her shout, she frightened not only her daughter, but also the hooded boy, who did not expect such a reaction. Only the devil himself could come up with the idea of controlling these things. The mage wanted to explain that he only wanted to help the state, but the woman ordered him to be silent and the court guards to escort him out of the palace. Wolfgang shouted to the guards to stop, begging His Majesty to wait with his conclusions and give him a chance to show the tool in action. He was not listened to, however. As the guards dragged him away from the eyes of the royalty, the object remained lying on the floor covered by the cloth the mage had brought. Remembering all the information she had heard, the girl tried to reach into the wolf's fur and pull out the bullet. Watching her movements, Mizary shouted at her to be careful, because at any moment the dog could turn around and bite her arm off. But the human child didn't listen to her and persisted in trying to grasp the object. As soon as she succeeded, she pulled it with all her might, ripping it out of the enemy's skin. The creature screamed in pain as it opened its jaws and froze in place. Mizary quickly ran over to the little girl and grabbed her in her arms, asking what had happened to the beast. All the while, the child, clenching her hand hard, held the engraved instrument in front of the fairy. That fur from which the girl pulled the object wriggled right in front of Linen's face, which squeamishly ordered it away from her. As soon as the dog finished his death cry, he immediately slumped to the ground. His paws jerked convulsively from time to time, but he was no longer a threat. At the fairy's screams, Mizary turned around at the sound of Gadis struggling. She didn't want to fight anymore, but the circumstances didn't give any chance to relax. The ogre was trying to deal with the dragon as quickly as possible. That attacked without sparing any effort. Clenching her palm harder, the girl realized that now it was her turn to fight. The dragon did not hold back and swung its claws in all directions, cleaving the air. Gadis was far from weak. One of his blows was equal to the strength of a lizard that thought it was nothing. Time after time, he crippled the enemy, causing him to retreat further and roar harder. As soon as the attack of its paws was interrupted, the dragon tried to grab the ogre with its jaws. For him, nothing was more important than his master's orders, so he continued to attack despite the fact that he was being maimed more and more each time. His movements seemed to be looped and repeated no matter how Gadis attacked him. However, this could be interrupted, so he grabbed the lizard by the lower jaw and pulled it down. A concussion was provided for him, as Gadis brought his head to the ground with all his might. The force of the blow was so great that it kicked up a huge amount of dust and small pebbles that, thanks to the wind created, flew at the girls, who had to shield their eyes from the flying debris. Gadis had long stripes on his chest that bled, but that only made his eyes bleed more. The fight was becoming less and less predictable with each blow. Gadis was being pushed back this time, Mizary stated the fact, so she asked the little girl to hide behind the rocks so she wouldn't get hit. However, the fairy agreed to hide, but for a better chance of survival, she told Mizary to go and help her man. But that was impossible. She herself would have been happy to fight shoulder to shoulder with him, but with wounds like these, she would simply be in his way. All she could do for the moment was to keep the child safe. But the girl continued to stand still, looking down at her hand. Mizary didn't let this go unnoticed. Looking at the shape of the object the child was holding, Mizary assumed that such magical tools were used by humans. By engraving a magic formula on it, one could acquire magical skills as a support. But why was it in the possession of a human child? Turning towards Mizary, the girl looked at her with a determined look that confused the female ogre, who didn't always understand what the girl wanted. However, the child was far from stupid and pointing at herself, and the woman tried to convey her idea. All the female ogre had to do was think fast. Seeing her gesture as if she was throwing something in the distance, Mizary realized that the child wanted to be sent somewhere. And after she pointed her hand in the direction of the deadly battle Gadis was in, she fully understood what was wanted of her. The determined child was 100% sure of her plan, but not Mizary, who had been trying so hard all along to keep her alive. Spreading her huge wings, the dragon yelled loudly as she wanted to attack Gadis again. What the child was pointing at was horrifying to any normal person who might have been lucky enough to see it. How bravely the girl wanted to sacrifice her life was impressive, but realizing it was impossible. If Gadis saw this, Mizary would be more than willing to take it head-on. Already anticipating how hard she would get, the female ogre turned to the child and responded by raising her voice heavily. Did the girl really want to die so badly that she was trying to do it with her hands? Surprisingly, Leonin stood up in defense of the human child, that she didn't understand why she was screaming. She, of course, guessed that Mizary was stupid, but this was just ridiculous. Getting out of the child's belt, the fairy said goodbye to everyone. She wasn't going to risk her life, and so she wanted to scurry off to her home. But the girl's hand got ahead of the fairy, so the child managed to grab her by the hem of her dress. No matter how much the magical creature would not tug, begging to let her go. But the little girl did not loosen her grip. Mizary, that saw the confidence in the child's eyes, didn't understand anything, but still decided to see if the girl had an idea. The girl didn't waste precious time, which they didn't have much of, so she nodded quickly. What she had in mind could only be realized with Mizary's support. Without her help, it was possible that everyone here would die. By agreeing to help the little girl, Mizary could easily give her a lift, but the enemy was too massive. The child's target was the dragon's head, where they were supposed to send her. Under all this talk of a plan, Lianin Sidi was trying to break free, constantly resenting why they wouldn't let her go. However, she was an integral part of the plan, something that would be able to back her up during the flight. The fairy wanted no part of this endeavor. Life was more important to her than any little people she knew. No matter what situation she found herself in, if there was an opportunity, she would throw her friends to pieces just to save her own skin. The girl was sure that a bow would help solve the misunderstanding, but no matter how politely she asked, the fairy did not agree. Such pleading wouldn't change anything, so the magical creature asked to be left out of it. Mizary, who was standing behind her, told the fairy to relax because the girl had already saved her from the wolf earlier, so it was time to do the honors. But Leonin didn't calm down and kept yelling that the enemy was actually targeting the child, and no one was saving her. She really didn't want to help the creatures around her. Any movement of the lizard and her beautiful life could be cut short in an instant. All the while, Gadis was trying to hold the huge creature in place. Of course, the plan was to defeat it, but looking reality in the eye, it was clear. It was impossible. Even in such a situation, if Mizary could, by some miracle, reach the creature's head, the child would be instantly dropped. The dragon was always moving, so it was impossible for a human to stand on it for long. The cowardly fairy understood it perfectly well and advised to give up such an idea. Being a small child in the thick of battle was not only dangerous, but deadly. It was unlikely that Mad Gadis, who was focused on destroying the lizard, would find time to think about how not to snag the little girl. However, if they managed to stop the dragon, it would be worth it, Mizary whispered as she watched the fierce battle. Only the fairy, held by the girl, shouted tiredly that it was impossible. Their reasoning for a perfectly thought-out plan would have lasted for a long time if not for the eerie voice of a creature that appeared out of nowhere. The creature that stood behind was asking where in the forest this dragon had come from. Turning around at the call, the girls didn't expect the unexpected guests to come to the sounds of war. Their long noses, short stature, and narrow eyes made their origins clear. An entire tribe of goblins had decided to pay them a visit. Led by their leader, who was the only one wearing a cloak with a wooden staff in his hands, they came to the ogres. Holding onto her wounded arm, Mizary told the girl to hide behind her as she would deal with them herself. When the child did as she was asked, the female ogre asked the guests what they wanted. But the leader only smiled, telling her to temper her fervor, for they had something dear to her. Seeing what they were carrying on their backs, Mizary cried out loudly the name of a friend. They brought the injured Muba, who was still unconscious. Chuckling wickedly and squinting his eyes, the ringleader asked to listen to what they wanted to deliver, if they valued their lives, of course. The head of the goblins tapped his staff on the ground and ordered to listen to what they had come to deliver to the ogre woman. Someone snuck up on the chief, for that human child did look appetizing, but the chief asked him to calm down. There was no need to rush things. That child was not their target. While they were talking, Mizary explained to the girl that the creatures that stood before them were goblins, so it was not a good idea to get close to them. They were a collection of the most disgusting creatures that lived in this world. Hearing her words, the fairy, continuing to insult the female ogre, said that she was the master of insulting strangers. The goblins only laughed in response to Mizary's words. No matter what insulting phrases she threw around, it wouldn't hurt them. However, returning to the main topic, the head of the newly arrived creatures replied that he had heard them going around making trouble collecting treasure. But that didn't matter now. It was important to subdue the lizard. The goblin wondered if they would really be able to subdue the dragon if they immobilized it. Looking at the child, Mizary realized that the child was not going to back down, so she answered the leader in the affirmative. However, it seemed almost impossible to suppress such a monster, to which the goblin only laughed when his assumptions were confirmed. To this, Mizary answered him that their tribe had nothing to do with it, and he could return to the settlement with all his staff. They might have done so if a familiar voice hadn't called out to her. Muba regained consciousness. Though his body was shaking and his eyes were bloodshot, he was ready to do it. To Mizary's surprise, the ogre could move, but he still needed some time to rest. The goblin leader tapped him lightly on the back with his staff, for he had made the right decision. They had brought him to the girls for that very reason. The goblins had been hiding in the bushes for a long time, picking up trash that people threw away. They often came to water bodies and rocks in search of beautiful, shiny things. And only at the end of the day, they would take the collected booty to put it all in wagons abandoned by people. By such a miracle, they managed to hide their collected treasures deep in the forest, hoping they had managed to keep them safe. As the unexpected story approached the wagons, Mizary finally realized what treasures they were talking about, and was ready to apologize. At least the whole thing could be blamed on the dragon. After all, he was the one who had destroyed the wagon when Gadis had knocked him to the ground. In any case, it was now clear what had broken so loudly. The goblins were unlucky to be near the collected booty at that moment, for before their eyes a wheel from the destroyed cart flew over their heads. They had to watch as the honestly collected treasure they had worked so hard to gather was destroyed. The dragon had destroyed everything they had built. It was an unforgivable sin for which they vowed to avenge in any way they could. Covering her chest with her hand, Mizary knew it was their friend's fault, but even Lenin kept silent, guessing they didn't need to know that. The head of the goblins understood that they were weak creatures, and it was precisely because of this that they had saved Muba. They asked the ogre to avenge them, to which he promised he would do his best. The ego was supported in this by his new friends, who cheered and wished him luck in his mission. Mizary, though, was not happy that the dragon was still left to them, but there was nowhere to go. While she was concerned about one thing, the goblin leader was stressed about another. He was worried about Gadis, asking Mizary if everything would be all right with the ogre that was holding the dragon back at the moment. Without realizing it, she hadn't really noticed how her friend had fallen into such a state. It was no longer him, but some feral creature who had no control over his actions. All he wanted was to win the battle as soon as possible. The lizard didn't seem to be tired, unlike Gadis, who was bleeding and automatically avoiding blows. Mizary shouted his name as his tired friend hesitated. The wide jaws of the beast almost managed to grab the ogre's body, but he had time to react and regroup. At the last moment he grasped the dragon's fangs, preventing it from closing its jaws. It would have been over in a moment. Gadis was well aware of the value of his life, but now he was risking more than just himself. Muba had rested while they had been talking and was ready to go to his aid now. The human child was sure that his participation wouldn't be unnecessary and everything would work out as best as possible. Smiling, Muba leaned over to the girl and asked that the hard work be given to him. He was ready to sacrifice his life for his brother, so he instantly ran towards the dragon Gadis was still holding. The girl waved happily at the ogre, wishing him good luck. The goblins of the whole tribe began to murmur behind the child's back, discussing something heatedly. Deciding that they needed to act, they turned to the leader with a request he had not expected to hear. Turning to the new acquaintances, the child did not understand why they gathered in a pile near their leader. As they went about their business, Gadis continued to restrain the overgrown lizard. He had immobilized its jaws, but its paws were free. It would have taken a few more seconds for the sharp claws to fatally wound him, but Muba was in time. Grabbing the paw, He squeezed it with force, gradually pushing it aside. Gadis was surprised that his friend was okay, but he didn't loosen his grip. Muba asked to keep his enemy immobilized for as long as possible. But this Gadis could not promise, as the dragon's right arm was straining him hard. It was free, so it could attack at any moment. However, the goblins that ran up asked to leave it on them. At this point, Gadis was discouraged by the fact that it was unclear who had joined their war. At least now he was not alone. However, the goblins kept smiling with gestures saying that everything was all right. The little girl waved at them, cheering them on, but even the leader himself called them a bunch of idiots. To say nothing of Mizary, who was no longer surprised by anything. Despite the fact that there were dozens of these little creatures, they were not a hindrance to the lizard. One by one, the goblins flew off to the sides. They couldn't hold it back, but they could easily get in the way. All the while, the creature's paws were busy in one way or another. Neither Gadis nor Muba realized what was happening, but continued to hold him. Mizary shouted that they didn't have to understand, and what they were already doing was more than enough. Muba, though, agreed to this plan, but he didn't hear the beginnings of what the child was talking about. Gadis wasn't privy to the plan at all, but what he saw made his heart drop to his heels. Mizary was holding the girl in her hand, for the purpose of throwing her at the dragon. Well, she was ready to play with the little girl and the fairy, though the child was determined to win, but here Linen wasn't of the same opinion. No one had asked her if she wanted it, causing her to yell like a slash. Gadis had no idea how to react to such a picture. Everything he did was for the girl's sake, and now she was being held for nothing. Gathering all the strength in her left hand, Mizary threw the human child as hard as she could at the dragon's head while it was immobilized. Wolfgang spent all this time with the honorable man. They gathered in a secret room that was poorly lit and held magical artifacts. The man with the cardinal's cap was no longer so sure of the magician's actions and was beginning to doubt the perfection of his plan. It was time for him to think about what to do if he failed to catch the child. Looking into the magic ball, which was so secluded on the table, Wolfgang continued to conjure. However, what he saw made him sigh in surprise. His reaction caught the attention of the man who had hired and trusted him, so he asked if everything was all right. To this, the mage replied that there was a small delay in the plan. Right before the dragon almost got rid of the annoying ogre, a group of goblins appeared. As such, they were not a problem. The goblins were only a bit of a nuisance by wandering around underfoot. The boy didn't understand why they were attacking his magical creature, relentlessly changing one after another. At least the reasons he didn't see. His plan was perfect. There couldn't be a single chance of failure creeping in, but somehow, just now, new variables were appearing. As he pondered the whole situation, he continued to control the dragon trying to get out of the shackles. Only one moment while he was talking to the man from the ruling top and his wolf Kusit was knocked out. He wondered what that slave princess Titania and the ogre woman were trying to pull. It was unlikely that a child would be able to defeat such a strong dragon. However, seeing his magic tool on the ground, Wolfgang felt an electric shock as he realized the seriousness of what was happening. He had used it to control the wolf, but now it was lying in the dirt, meaningless. The mage didn't recall the moment when it had been spotted and pulled out. Wolfgang was sure that no one knew of its effect, but remembering that the last time he had an audience with His Majesty, a girl had been present. That was when he realized that she had had time to get a glimpse of the instrument. Pulling himself together, he ordered the owl to dive and prevent Titania from getting close to the dragon. Unfortunately, she was able to figure out his plan, thus calling his entire operation into question. At that moment, Mizary was able to toss the baby towards the dragon, giving the owl the perfect chance to attack. The child continued to fly forward with purpose, holding the fairy, who was always trying to escape. Seeing the feathered creature's unnatural behavior, Mizary warned the human child that the owl was chasing her. Turning her head to the side, Titania did indeed see the bird approaching in her direction. The owl quickly released its talons for a strike, bursting to snatch the magical tool from the princess's hands. However, it should not be forgotten that the forest creature continued to be in the palms of the child's hands. Although the fairy didn't want to risk her life, she still used some of her mana. In return, as a reward, she demanded to be introduced to the handsome owner of the slave girl. From what the girl had told her, Linen had managed to make up her own damn mind without even realizing that she had already met her master. Using a fraction of her power, the fairy increased the size of her body, thus covering the child from injury. Doing a flip in the air, the forest creature kicked away the owl that dared to attack her. Mizary, who had been watching the deviation in their plan, praised Linen's Seedy and her lightning-fast reaction that kept the child safe. Gadis, who was holding back the demon's jaws with all his might, only grew more frustrated. There were getting to be too many weirdos on their team. Although the winged fairy managed to fight back, but she didn't scream any less. Her beautiful dress dared to be torn when she avoided the claws of the feathered one, which made her complain louder and louder. Wolfgang resented watching as more creatures joined in to ruin his ingenious plan. Lianan and Sidhe continued to hover in the air, keeping the girl on top of her and gradually moving closer to the dragon. Looking down, she noticed that the creature was beginning to move. The goblins had been neutralized, which meant no one was holding its paw. Beside it, the owl also began to return to the girls. It was necessary to act without delay. The fairy asked to use it as a springboard and head to that pesky dragon at last. Rising from her lying position to her feet, the little girl jumped off the fairy's body, accidentally hitting her in the face with her foot. She was hovering relatively close to the lizard and managed to grab onto a hair that was sticking out of the creature's mane. Titania tried with all her might to hold on to it, resting her feet on the sharp scales and locking herself in place. She succeeded. Now the lives of dozens of creatures were in the hands of the child, who only had to get to the magic tool. Watching this picture, the former court mage began to panic more and more, ordering the owl to pull her away from the dragon as quickly as possible. Hearing the owner's words, the dragon also began to actively open its jaws and pull its paws from the ogre's hands. All of this prevented the small child from climbing further up its mane, causing it to dangle in different directions. Gadis realized that letting the dragon go was not an option, and since the overgrown lizard wanted to close its jaws, he would help it do so. Releasing its fangs and waiting for it to close its mouth, Gadis squeezed its jaws with force, forcing it to the ground. As the ogre pulled his head toward him, the child's inertia, holding onto his hair, sent him flying forward toward the magical control mechanism. It took a tremendous amount of time and strength to pull it off, but the human child managed to reach the engraved magical object. Grabbing it as hard as she could, she pulled it upward, ripping the unfortunate thing alive. Now it seemed one could rejoice in their imminent victory. However, due to the pain delivered by the girl, the dragon abruptly raised its head to the sky with its maw open and let out a deafening roar. Even Gadis couldn't hold it longer, causing him to have to relax his arms. But he didn't have time to step back, so the beast's head caught the ogre, tossing him high into the air. Everything seemed to be going wrong. Gadis was in the air, giving him a chance to strike one last blow. And while he was heading for the sky, Muba and the girl were falling down, causing the child to get hurt. He weighed the pros and cons of the situation and decided to deal with the enemy first, as Mizary was on the ground to provide backup at any time. Raising his hands above his head, Gadis gathered them into a lock. In the last minute, because of the reptile, there was a lot of problems. But for starters, the dragon was going to be defeated. The ogre shouted and kicked him in the head with all his might. Gadis gathered all his strength for the final blow, and under the force of gravity, Gadis picked up speed as he continued to fall downward. As soon as he was level with the dragon's head, he struck it in the top of the head, knocking it to the ground. The lizard's legs instantly collapsed under its own weight, and only a low growl of pain escaped him. From such a blow, the lizard's body sank several meters into the ground, lifting the rock and creating an artificial ditch. Gadis continued to fall from a great height with his head downwards, and it would have been impossible to get away with a couple of bruises. When Muba saw him fall, he rushed forward. Looking up, he swung his legs to catch his friend before he reached the ground. Unfortunately, Gadis was no miniature girl, and catching him without getting hurt would be difficult. At such great speed, Muba caught him, but unable to stay on his feet, he was immediately pinned to the ground. Getting up off poor Muba, Gadis thanked his friend for his help, so when he quickly stood up, he gave his hand to the guy to get up as well. Seeing Gadis on the ground, Mizary with all her might rushed to run and hug the ogre. He didn't want to lose his status as a proud and brutal ogre, so he asked Mizary not to cling to him like that because he was hurting. At the same time, Muba just covered his eyes in shame. After the fight was over, they needed a break and relaxed without realizing it. But as soon as the long-awaited silence came, the ogre woman asked, "Where is the baby?" Before she had asked that question, no one had ever thought of the existence of a human child. Even the goblins stared silently in the direction of the huge, scaly creature. The dragon lay bleeding in the copious amounts of dust that was kicked up by the wind. They imagined the worst that could happen, but somewhere in the back of their minds, they hoped that Titania was alive. The mud was still on the ground, and the field of vision was limited. Even the body of the dragon could only be seen from a height, not to mention the short stature of the goblins. Eventually, however, the silhouette of a flying creature could be seen in the distance, hovering slowly above the surface of the ground. There was something in its hands, but they were too far away to discern. It wasn't until Leonin Sidhe flew out of the thick dust that everyone could see the little girl happily twirling her little hand from side to side. Even the fairy breathed a sigh of relief when she managed to catch the little girl, who had been trying to hold on to the magical object the whole time she was falling. When she was released from the embrace, the child hopped forward to the dozen or so creatures that had been worried about her the whole time. As soon as everyone saw that she was alive and well, the surrounding forest erupted in joyous shouts. The goblin tribe as one cried out in praise of the child. Even the ogres, who continued to sit in a pile, looked with a smile in their eyes at the child who had managed to save dozens of lives. When Titania stopped, she raised her magical instrument upward, saying that it was time to celebrate the final victory. Even the tired Leonin, down on the nearest rocks, covered her eyes and sighed heavily. It had been a long time since she had used so much of her power for someone else as well, but now it was over. Everyone was rejoicing over the victory over the huge monster, especially the goblin tribe. They promised to avenge the destruction of their treasure, and they did. The creatures continued to praise the girl and even began to worship her, but a sudden scream halted their celebration. The ogres raised their heads to the sky and squinted their eyes against the sun that was shining in their faces. There was another creature in the air that they had forgotten about. The owl continued to circle above them, occasionally shrieking as if to warn them that it would soon take its revenge. Meanwhile, somewhere far away in the dark room, the orb that was the only source of light was showing an unpleasant outcome for the owner. The boy, who never seemed to take off his robe, was shaking with anger. His head was pressed into his shoulders, which were constantly slumped up and down. The man who had been with Wolfgang all this time asked what had happened. Had his plan, which had no flaws, failed? But the former court mage only gritted his teeth. Because of some little girl, the tool that allowed him to control the dragon had been taken out. Not only had the ogre defeated him, but it would be of no use to him. The boy did not want to admit defeat, but there was nowhere to go, and he bowed his head and asked for forgiveness. The interlocutor, hearing such a statement, became furious. He had been promised that Wolfgang would handle everything, but now, because of his blunder, they had lost one of their precious dragons. The man shouted spitting spittle and angrily asked how the mage would fix this, but the guy was silent. He had no excuses, so he stood quietly in front of the ball. The man in the dark robe instantly jumped out of the room, snorting indignantly. He had warned that he would receive his punishment later, which he hoped the mage would be prepared for. The door slammed shut with a loud thud as the man closed them behind him with all his might, unable to control his anger. Wolfgang himself was not happy about what was happening. He was angry too, and he was beating his fists on the table, causing the magical sphere to slide to the edge. The boy cursed the moment when Titania came into this world. To him, the girl was just like her mother, who got in his way every time she had the chance. It was unforgivable. His facial expression expressed murderous intent and the desire to end her once and for all. However, more problems needed to be dealt with. A few minutes later, two guards who wore cloaks over their iron armor entered the room. They came to inform Wolfgang that he had been summoned by the council and needed to go with them. But the room was completely empty. Only the echo of the knights' voices echoed off the empty walls, repeating over and over again. This building had only one way in and one way out. There was no way they could have missed him in the corridor, which itself was no more than a meter long. The head of the guards ordered them not to relax because he had to be somewhere close by. He couldn't go far. Meanwhile, the princess, in the company of Leonin, wandered through the forest. The fairy was not happy all the time, and not for the first time said that she was tired. She had helped the human child in the battle with the dragon. Now she was waiting for the child to fulfill her promise. But the little girl did not recall any such thing, so she continued to walk carefree. However, the fairy was stubborn and reminded her that she was going to introduce her to her handsome and rich master. After she was reminded of Gadis, she perked up dramatically, remembering that there really was such a thing. After waving her head a few times, she ran up to Gadis, who didn't realize what was going on. Looking at the huge ogre with spikes on his shoulders and blood on his chest, Leonin was disappointed in this life. This had never happened before in her practice. The fairy yelled at the child not to show off the ogre because it was not cool at all. But the girl was of a different opinion and did not agree with her assertion. Putting her hands up, she ran around the fairy that she decided that the girl wanted to fight her. Gadis alone, who had been silent the whole way, asked them to stop fighting. In a way, he still didn't even know what this winged creature was until now. Leonin, pulling the child by the cheek when she heard her name called, barked at him to be quiet. The goblins that walked with them laughed relentlessly, plunging the forest into laughter. It was a sight for them to see a servant of their goddess being scolded. Gadis was beginning to get a headache from the excessive brainwork. He didn't know who those short creatures were or why they were so friendly with Muba. He didn't understand what kind of fairy flew after the child and screamed very often. The only question on his mind was, what's going on here? Even Mizary, who was walking beside him covering his chest, told Gadis that he looked more exhausted than when he fought the dragon. When they reached their base, the ogres left the guests outside, and Mizary and Gadis went into the wooden building. She sat Gadis on the floor and stood behind him with her arms out in front of her. Mizary began to whisper strange words that no one around her knew, and her body became covered in many striped marks. As she recited the spell, a warm, bright light began to pour from her hands and gradually enveloped the ogre's wounds. It didn't take long, so when she was done, Gadis turned his head back to look at the spot that had been sore until recently. That was all she could do for today. Though she tried to patch up her friend as discreetly as possible, there was no getting rid of the scar. However, for the ogre, even this result was fine, so he praised his friend's excellent work. Darok, who was lying on the bed in the same room, also expressed his gratitude to Mizary, for he felt better now. If it wasn't for that battle with the dragon, maybe he would never have known that she could use healing magic. Mizary was glad she was helpful, but it wasn't much like magic, more like a demonic technique, Mizary explained as the chatter outside continued. Gadis was worried about leaving the child with those strange creatures and kept looking at the doorway where the shadows of passing creatures sometimes appeared. However, the ogre woman reassured him that there was nothing to worry about, everything was as usual. The girl stood still for a while the goblins came up to her and shook hands. Lenin flew around and asked them not to jostle, but to line up like civilized goblins. According to her, all their offerings to the goddess would be collected by Muba, and congratulations would be accepted by the goddess herself. One goblin is one handshake. As they left the house, Mizary and Gadis silently watched the offerings to the human child, who was smiling happily. To the goblins, their goddess was beautiful, so next time they were going to find and bring more offerings. Muba continued to stand beside the baby girl, stretching his arms forward. Eventually, a bunch of delicious and juicy fruits appeared in his empty palms. They had organized a fruitful event today, after all. Mizary continued to watch them skeptically. Still, she marveled at what they had managed to pull off. For Gadis, who thought narrowly, this was a gift from heaven. Now they didn't have to search for food, which made Ogrim's life much easier. But a disgruntled Mizary twisted her head in displeasure at this. She didn't like the idea of getting it all from goblins, and anyway, how long was this Leonanan city going to stay with them? While the ogres were talking amongst themselves, the fairy quickly flew up to them and shouted at the top of her voice in front of their faces. She ordered them to listen to her carefully, for she was the most valuable one on the team and acted as the one who helped defeat that dragon. Lenin considered herself the most valuable, so she had the right to stay with them as long as she wanted. Listening to what the fairy Mizary had to say, she was only surprised that she was confident, and she recognized that. Taking an apple in her hands, the fairy took a couple bites. Her gaze read that she was hatching an insidious plan. The offerings might be simple food now, but eventually the goblins would start bringing them furs or other materials that they could sell to the merchant. She couldn't wait for that to happen, but Mizary only asked for things to be left as they were. Mizary was fine with life before this, so she didn't see anything supernatural in these offerings. Besides, if the fairy doesn't like it, no one is holding her back. She doesn't have to put up with it. Titania, as if she felt the gaze on her, turned to the girls and clenched her fists in front of her to show that she was satisfied with everything. Even the fairy looking at the child realized that Mizary would not be able to help the little girl in her scheme. Responding to the girl's gesture, Mizary assured her that everything was fine and only asked her to let her know if the offerings became too much. But the human child continued to stand still and shake the goblin's hands with a smile while Muba got more and more food. As night fell, everyone dispersed to the places they had chosen to sleep. Finished with her worship, the fairy didn't want to be surrounded by the rude snoring creatures, so she flew off not far into the forest, where she settled down on a leafy plant. She had almost fallen asleep, but a quiet rustle of grass caught her attention, and she had to get up. It was dark in the thicket of tall trees, but Lenin managed to make out the silhouette of a small girl sneaking alone. She disappeared as quickly as she had appeared, leaving behind a small silhouette that rustled its feet. The forest fairy didn't understand what was going on, so she made the decision to report the escape. Rising from the foliage, she flew into the settlement, which was humming with snores. Finding the right building, she flew to Gadis, shouting his name loudly, but he couldn't be awakened by a cannon, let alone the voice of a small forest dweller. She didn't like being ignored, so she used brute force. It wasn't until she kicked the ogre in the nose that he stirred. Squinting his eyes, he rubbed his sore nose, which had become so because of the fairy. Gadis grudgingly asked Lenin why she was struggling and what she wanted from him so late, but the fairy only asked him to follow her. After explaining what happened, Gadis realized that the little girl had gone into the forest, but he didn't see anything strange about it. However, the fairy was sure that everything was for a reason. The direction was exactly the same as last time. The other day she had gone in the same direction, and then the dragon had appeared. Now it wasn't safe even for an ogre. Running past the campfire where Muba was sleeping that he was supposed to be guarding, Gadis called the boy with him. Now the three of them were running to find the child, following the fairy that had been so fortunate to see her. The ogres looked around for any trace the little girl might have left behind. She could be quite cunning if she wanted to be, but she could not escape Lenin's keen eyes. She was the first to see Titania standing near a large tree, but when they came closer, they saw something they had not hoped to see for years. That thick mane near the horns, Gadis would have nightmares about for a long time to come. Looking at such a picture, the fairy froze, pointing her finger forward without even making a sound. A huge dragon with a healed scar on his forehead was gently taking fruit from the hands of a little girl, near whom a wolf was quietly eating. The wolf quickly raised his head and stared at the newly arrived guests, but did not stop wagging his tail in joy. The overgrown lizard did not shy away from the ogres, so it continued its meal, stuffing more and more food into its mouth. That was a situation Gadis hadn't expected to find himself in. He couldn't believe that these docile creatures were the beasts that almost took his life. Still, they were a danger to the girl, and as a responsible parent he pointed his hand menacingly in the direction ordering the little girl to get rid of them. Linan Sidhe, once she realized they were not what they had been recently, sighed with relief, and muttered that Titania was like a child looking after abandoned puppies. Still, something had to be done, so they compromised and headed for the house. The goblins continued their treks to the banks of the river to get more valuables. They delighted in everything they could find, even a smooth stone that they would gladly present to the goddess. But one day their carefree life was interrupted by two strangers. While they were collecting their offerings, the ogres, who were several times their height, asked if they had seen any creatures like them in the neighborhood. Gadis didn't understand where the two had come from, so he advised the child to get rid of them. When they heard what the ogre said, the beasts stared at him with eyes full of incomprehension. Speaking to the little girl, he reminded her that he had almost died fighting that dragon. He had treated the girl too well, causing the fairy to say that he was not like the ogre, that he acted like a villain with his spare food. However, the conversation between the ogre and the girl was interrupted by the wolf that asked them to listen. Gadis had met many different creatures on his journey, but a wolf that talks, never. Leanin, however, decided to explain to the stupid creature that he was a high-class spy, so as long as he wasn't driven mad, he could talk just fine. In addition, the fairy decided to remind that she too belonged to the spies, but of the magical class. Though the flying creature wanted to help Gadis, he asked her to shut up for a few seconds. She didn't hear a word of thanks for her kindness, but she didn't make a scandal out of it. Instead, the wolf himself began to explain that when they were resting in the forest, severely wounded in front of them, appeared a human child who came to their aid, and strangely enough, it explained a lot. Thanks to him, Gadis realized why the child was gathering food from those goblins. It was only because she had saved them that the wolf and dragon wanted to stay by her side to help. Even Muba, who usually didn't get into the conversation, realized that having such a dog around would make it easier to do guard duty at night. Gadis agreed with his friend's assertion, so he wondered how best to use them. Finally, Gadis answered that he would gladly accept them, but if they would serve the tribe faithfully, for which the wolf was eternally grateful. The fairy didn't understand why they would accept such dangerous creatures and didn't want to put up with them. But the wolf was half the trouble. What about the giant dragon? The reptile replied to the question that he was going to return to his nest, where no one would bother him. However, he could stay with them, and having him around would definitely be helpful. He could carry rocks or transport them long distances, but that one turned out to be it. Even the girl that heard his reply instantly became saddened. Once the lizard noticed her emotions, then asked his princess not to make such a face. After all, he wasn't leaving forever. Titania reached forward and stroked the dragon's head. He is a creature standing on top of all life in this world. He needs to go back into hiding to right this monstrous wrong caused by his appearance. But his gratitude is forever with the child. The fight with Gadis was an interesting one for him. The dragon would be glad if a rematch could be arranged when he came to his senses. Hearing the tempting offer, the ogre replied that he would look forward to the next encounter. Opening his eyes wider, the dragon in a menacing voice ordered him to keep an eye on the girl. The lizard wanted her looked after at least until he returned, and then he would take care of it himself. After saying goodbye to everyone, the majestic beast spread its wings and rose high into the sky until its silhouette disappeared behind the trees. Meanwhile, Mizary slept peacefully under a tree, unaware of where her friends were now. She would have continued to watch her beautiful dreams had it not been for the strong wind that blew over the tops of the trees, making them creak and the leaves rustle. The ogre woman opened her eyes with difficulty and saw a large and long body that made it impossible to see the clouds in the sky. Mizary stiffened in mute question, huddled in the trunk near where she slept. "What is the dragon doing here?" she asked herself, for she had seen it collapse without making a sound. The dragon continued to fly farther away, but she continued to stare after it. At one point she had the courage to rise to her feet, but Mizary didn't take her eyes off where the terrifying creature had been. "It's finally gone," muttered Gadis, rubbing his head, which continued to ache more. But the fairy encouraged the ogre and advised him not to be discouraged, because the dragon promised that he would come to help if anything happened. This was confirmed by the wolf, who followed the child until they came upon Mizary. She was trembling, pointing forward and muttering something nonsensical that Gadis didn't understand. The frightened Mizary pried every detail from Gadis, to which he dutifully answered. As they talked, the bored child looked around for something interesting, but when she saw something she didn't want, she ran up to her savior and tugged at his clothes. Turning around to the child, Gadis asked what had happened again. Even the wolf stepped forward of the little girl, protecting her. Lifting their gaze forward, the ogres noticed guests they hadn't seen in a long time, and probably didn't even want to meet in the future. "Is this where you are camped?" asked an unfamiliar ogre with a gray beard. He looked like an old man, but his pumped-up body, which was concealed by clothes from someone else's hide, said otherwise. It had been quite some time since their last meeting. Gadis, without realizing it himself, quickly shouted out the stranger's name. It was Gayon's grandfather that had gone in search of his grandson. Each shouted the other's name as Gadis ran towards the old man. Their faces expressed the joy of meeting, and it seemed to end in a friendly embrace. But we're talking about the strongest ogres, the ones that were notable for their bloodthirstiness. Running close enough to him, Gadis slammed his fist into the old man's face. The girl, the fairy, and the dog opened their mouths in surprise, not expecting such a turn of events. Gayhan dodged the next blow just by crouching down a bit, surprising Gadis. While he was at a loss, the elderly ogre kicked his grandson in the head with all his might. He was glad that Gadis was doing well, and praised him for not being a wimp, while wiping the blood from his cracked lip. The spiked-shouldered ogre was contentedly accepting the praise while kneading his muscles. He was merely responding to his grandfather in kind. Mizary, who saw the little girl's concern, asked her not to cry. They just needed to be left alone since that was how they greeted each other. However, it was strange even for Lenin to see such a wild greeting. While she was soothing the baby, a familiar voice could be heard behind Mizary, telling her that she hadn't changed much. Slowly, a tall ogre began to emerge from the forest, and all attention turned to it. Frowning her eyebrows, Mizary asked why her brother had come to her. Hearing that word, the girl and the fairy were surprised to see Mizary's relative. But if she hadn't said it, they would have realized it, for the newly arrived ogre was a full copy of Mizary. He answered her question by saying that they had come to them to bring her back to their village. She was to become an ogre shaman, following in the footsteps of their grandmother. Wolf had not encountered such a phrase, so Lenin explained that it was something like the leader of the group. She could also be called a queen if it made more sense. However, Mizary didn't want that and openly hinted that she wasn't going anywhere with him, but if she refused, then her sibling would have to use force and so go to the settlement. A real war broke out between the relatives, and no one understood the reason for it but the two of them. Two battered ogres of different ages sat down in the middle of the clearing, leaning on their backs. The old man kept saying that Gadis had gotten stronger. To this, he replied that grandfather should finally get it out of his head. Though he was glad that Gayhan was able to come to them, he still wanted to know the reason why they were looking for them. As soon as the old man heard the question, he immediately remembered that they only wanted Mizary. However, she was nearby. While they were fighting, Mizary continued to shout with her brother. When Grandpa saw Mistin and her sister fighting, he intruded on their conversation, shouting for them to calm down. However, Mistin didn't want to back down, so he told Gayhan to help him, because they needed to take the future shaman to the settlement by force. Mizary was also stubborn, and prepared her fists and wished her brother luck in this matter. No matter what happened, she wasn't going to give up so easily. There was even more shouting than from the fairy, who had been annoying everyone for a long time, but now she had competition. Hearing his sister express herself, Mistin ordered her to put that nasty tone down. He couldn't even believe that she had changed her behavior so much just because she had found a man, but at such a statement, Mizary blushed and began to deny it. She told him not to believe everything they said, but the cunning fairy kept adding fuel to the fire. Lenin flew to the boy's ear and began to tell him how Mizary had recently tried to seduce the ogre with her breasts, but he hadn't noticed. They hadn't gotten that close to each other yet. His brother asked the fairy if it was true, but when Mizary overheard them talking, she told them to shut up. Mistin believed everything the forest fairy told him and turned to Gadis and told him that he would not be able to get away with it. But Gadis didn't seem to be surprised at anything anymore and only expected more surprises from fate. It seemed that his brother was angry that his sister had an object of admiration, but everything went wrong. Angry Mistin was on his way to Gadis to tell him what he thought of him. He was unhappy that despite the fact that his sister had used her female body to seduce him, Gadis hadn't even blinked an eye. He didn't like the idea that an ogre who disrespected Mizary would be with her. The female ogre blushed ever thicker, pouring in crimson. She resented such logic, but even now Gadis was dumbfounded and didn't understand what Mistin was talking about. Even the dim-witted Muba realized it was his brother's fault. His brother was getting closer and closer to Gadis, and he was about to administer the divine punishment of a beating. But the spiked ogre easily swung his arm forward and hit the boy right on the cheek. Mistin instantly flew backwards into his sister's legs and continued to lie on the grass. After so many words that the guy had said the silence was very tense, they even came up to him to see if he was alive. However, everything was fine. It was just that Gadis hadn't calculated the force, and now the guy was completely unconscious. There was nothing to do. Since the fighting had stopped and there was time for a calm conversation, they took the boy and went to the village. There they learned that Dasari's grandmother had fallen ill. Fortunately, her life was not in danger, but as the successor and next ogre shaman, she needed to return. It was up to her now. After listening to the pleas of the newly arrived acquaintances, Gadis questioned her friend if she was going to become a shaman, for that was madness. Remembering days past, Mizary reminded her brother that she had been banished from the village, but Mistin corrected her, for the banishment only concerned Gadis, and she had simply followed him. Gadis, who had been sitting quietly listening to the conversation, corrected her. It seemed to him that what Mizary meant to say was that she wanted to go on a journey, and that was why she had followed him. At least that's what he had thought all along. The fairy that sat on his shoulder couldn't stand the bluntness and asked permission to hit him. She didn't want to believe that Gadis didn't understand anything even when told directly, so she ran around him and annoyed the man with indignation. Mizary didn't want to get involved in their embarrassing conversation, so she went back to the original conversation. She wasn't happy with the village's decision anyway, so until they got Gadis back, she wasn't going anywhere. Grandpa Gahan pondered her words. It was unlikely that the headmen would change their minds, but it was worth a try. After all, Gadis had been kicked out because he had broken Saban's horn in a fight, which was considered a crippling insult. Mizary justified what her friend had done because she had been attacked and wanted to abuse her body, and Gadis had saved her, but Mistin wouldn't listen. Saban was the son of an influential family, and the fact that Gadis had escaped the death penalty was only a miracle. Her brother assured Mizary that she was no longer a child. If she continued to be stubborn, they would have to drag her back whether she liked it or not. However, Mizary continued to stand her ground and the shouting and swearing returned. They continued to walk in a circle, and while they talked, the little girl was busy doing her own thing. During this time, she had time to boil water and make a nice fruity tea, which she poured into cups and carried them on a tray, carefully approaching the guests. The girl gave out the delicious drink in a friendly manner, and even the wild ogres politely thanked the child for the treat. She was glad when the shouting stopped, but the child hadn't realized that the cup so large for her would be so small for the guests. Even Gadis eyed the dishes with suspicion, but did not let it show so as not to upset the child. After handing out the treats, the girl grabbed the tray with both hands, bowed and ran back home with the wolf. Everyone was sipping their drinks with pleasure, even forgetting about that conversation. But Mizary was the first to ask what they were talking about, to which her brother reminded her that they would take her home any way they could. Even Gahan, who was sitting quietly by his side, confirmed his words. Leonan and Siti, who was flying around them, suggested that ogres had something in their character that made them weak towards human children. However, they needed to get back on track, so the old man asked Mizary if she would be willing to become a shaman huge if they lifted the punishment for Gadis. They would still have plenty of time to think and decide what to do. After all, the matter wasn't urgent. Even the old man was willing to give her a day or two to digest the situation, if they weren't interrupted. Their conversation was interrupted by Muba, who kept looking around in a panic. He was the first to notice that something was wrong, for some of the bushes were unnaturally moving all the while rustling. And as soon as the ogre noticed it, several arrows flew in their direction. The arrows almost hit Gadis and Muba, making it clear that this was a warning. They had forgotten how Darak had warned them a few days ago about the mountain hunters that were prowling around, so now they were threatened. Even the wolf that had been wandering near the girl the whole time had howled at the danger. They were not so afraid for themselves, but if they caught the little girl, they would cause irreparable damage to her health. Muba and Gadis rushed to the child's defense, but since the boy was closer than the man, he was faster in front of the human child. He managed to shield her from a flying arrow that hit him in the shoulder almost halfway through. Despite the throbbing pain, Muba grabbed the girl as best he could, covering her body with his arms. Gadis praised his friend for his swiftness, but suddenly he began to sway, falling to the ground. Gadis didn't realize what was happening to Muba, who was on all fours trying to stay conscious. Grandfather Gehan ran up to them, and after examining Muba, he concluded that it was the work of the poison that had impregnated the spearheads. Gadis tearfully begged his friend to hold on until the last moment, or at least until they were in the forest. The men continued to stare after the monsters that had managed to hide in the thick of the forest. 4 people stood and watched their escape through binoculars. As expected, the hunt for the monsters began. The ogres managed to escape quite a distance, and when they saw that there was no tail behind them, they put Muba on the ground. The boy was breathing loudly and frequently as the poison spread through his veins, poisoning every part of his body. Mizary tried to use her shaman skills on him to ease his suffering, so she was covered in marks. However, no matter how hard she tried, her strength alone could not get rid of the poison. Was there nothing else they could do? Gehan folded his arms across his chest and decided that only someone with more power would be able to do something. Mizary immediately realized that Grandfather was referring to Grandmother Mizary. She might be the only one who could neutralize the power of the poison, but Mizary didn't like that idea. It seemed they would use any excuse to persuade her to go to the village. The little princess heard all of this. She understood everything, so she decided that without the shaman, Muba would die. For that reason alone, the child bowed her head to Mizary, asking to go with them to the ogre settlement. Even Gadis tearfully begged her friend to help Muba. That saved the little girl from a painful death by a poisoned arrow. Mizary had no reason to refuse in such an emergency that required instant decisions. She agreed to return to the village and ask the current shamaness, Dizari, for help. The faces of Titania and Gadis immediately showed their joy. They were pleased that Mizary continued to listen to her friends despite her disagreement with her family. At the same moment, the old ogre and Gadis took the collapsed Muba under their arms and dragged him forward. Gehan was glad she had made the right decision, so was happy to help Muba, who was tiredly mumbling something. The only thing the ogres around him wanted him to do was to hold on a little longer. As they walked along the edge of the forest, Mistin stopped the whole company and asked Gadis to look back. As soon as he turned around, he heard loud peals of thunder that flickered unnaturally often before his eyes, accompanied by a large amount of lightning. The mages were burning their house to the ground, leaving behind only a handful of ashes. The ogres did not understand what people were thinking, because it would be logical to wait for the monsters to return to the place and then attack. But they could not understand human thoughts. They continued their sorcery, causing the dry grass to burn. The house in which Titania had so diligently made a bed caught fire first, causing the walls of the building to crunch and collapse, scattering sparks all around. The 3 men continued to stand in the smoke, enjoying a job well done while watching the bright fire dancing across the wooden objects. The guy who was additionally running around with torches and setting fire to everything the fire couldn't reach reported to Strauss that he was done with his part. The head praised his men for their work and told everyone to move on. Putting the iron helmet on their heads, the cruel hunters left the place where they had destroyed everything to the ground. Now the ogres had no place to return to. All the boards were burned, causing the house to collapse noisily without support. Meanwhile, the human child continued to walk with everyone to the village from which her savior had been kicked out. She turned around very often and did not know who to ask questions to, for everyone was downcast because of the unpleasant situation that the humans had created. Linan and Sida noticed the little girl's agitation and flew over to her and asked her what was wrong. Ruffling her hair, the child tried to explain the reason for her upset by showing the look of the person she was worried about, on herself. Realizing that she was referring to Darak, the fairy convinced the child that there was no need to worry. He knew how to take care of himself, plus Mizary had patched him up and he was feeling more than healthy. However, what about the forest fairy herself? Gadis asked the flying creature. Was she not minded to go with them to a place where many huge ogres lived that were not noted for their manners? But the proud Lenin flew closer to the ogre and asked him if he thought she would stay with the humans. The fairy preferred to go with them, only because she didn't want to be surrounded by crazy lunatics shooting around and setting the forest on fire. Hearing such a quick answer, the ogre quickly said that he understood and did not address her anymore so as not to hear any unnecessary shouting. They walked long and hard, but as soon as they reached the border, Gadis called the girl to him and pointed ahead. Throwing a glance in the indicated direction, before the child opened a marvelous landscape of waterfalls that merged into one huge lake. Under the rays of the sun, the water was creating rainbows, which added even more beauty to such a picture. Titania, along with the wolf, quickly ran up to the lake that was accumulating at the bottom of the slope. She looked down and watched the many creatures with scales that swam quickly in different directions. Gadis was sure the child was tired from such a long journey and hungry. Finding a rock nearby that was as big as 2 of his palms, he threw it forward. After the heavy object hit the lake, it made a lot of noise from which everyone could hear the squelch of the water. Behind him, it also lifted up all the liquid, the splashes of which hit those around him. The fairy suffered most of all, as she tried to fly away from the drops so as not to get her wings wet. The child was not happy with the fact that he was completely wet from the ogre's amusement, but as soon as the ogre asked to look into the water, the child was surprised. The impact of the large rock had stunned all the fish, and they had floated to the surface, making them easy to collect. But even Lianen realized that this way of catching fish was against the rules. Gadis didn't understand what he had broken, so she explained that disrupting the natural flow would cost him dearly. It was because of the accumulated boulders that it could happen, so he decided to stop. They had some food anyway, so he hadn't broken the rules too much, Gadis said as he put the fish on the branches that the happy child had brought. Everyone sat around the fire quietly eating the food they had gotten. Mizary interrupted her friend's slurping and asked how much further they had to go to the village, to which Gehan replied that it was on the other side of the mountain. Such a distance would normally take 10 days, but given the poisoned Muba that the princess was looking after, perhaps the journey would take longer. Gadis hoped that Muba could last that long, so during the day he carried the lad on his back, periodically alternating with the old man. They all tried to walk for as long as possible, almost never stopping for a break, so the wolf had to carry the tired Titania on his back. Their journey was long, but as soon as they passed the rocky terrain, they breathed a sigh of relief. Stopping at the edge of the cliff, they had a marvelous view. The girl and the fairy even opened their mouths, not expecting to see a settlement of such size. In front of them stood a large village, which was located along the riverbed, which flowed into the vast sea. Their houses consisted only of flat stones that were stacked on top of each other. Nothing seemed to grow there, so the view was a little deserted, but they were glad to be home at last. As soon as they descended the slope, they found themselves near the stone fence that closed the circle. The Gahan, seeing his acquaintances, greeted them and shouted that they had finally returned. The entire settlement quickly surrounded the arriving acquaintances, welcoming them home. They had waited long enough for their return, all the while wondering if they would be able to persuade Mizary. The adults of the settlement were followed by the little ones, who loudly questioned their grandfather about the journey, begging him to tell them what he had seen. Mizary explained to the confused fairy that the older man was raising orphans whose parents had been taken away by the war. Once upon a time, he had also tutored Gadis and Muba. Now Lenin understood why the children greeted their grandfather with such joy. To avoid misunderstandings, Gadis decided to correct her, saying that the old man was simply respected here, but no one idealized him. At that very moment, however, the children quieted down, staring at Gadis, who had spoken so highly of their teacher. They began to whisper about Gadis back and forth. In a way, it disappointed him, making him feel the pain of a broken heart. In this life, as often as now, the children had not insulted him. But leaving the children behind, they continued to follow Mistin, which led them to their destination. After almost 2 weeks, they reached the man that was able to heal their friend. In front of them stood a huge stone building surrounded by similar towers around the area. At first glance, it resembled a pyramid, but unlike it had only one room. Stepping inside the temple of the ogre shamaness Mizary, they saw a female ogre who wore a long robe with wide sleeves. The head greeted Mizary, who had been chased by everyone for so long. Servants brought the guests a large hide on which Gadis laid his friend, and he himself, with the others, sat down opposite the chief. Mizary had ordered Mistin to bring back only the ogre woman, so he did not understand why the banished Gadis had also come, together with the half-dead Muba. However, he explained that some circumstances had come up that made it impossible to do otherwise. Mizary immediately cried out to her grandmother that she should forget about her past grievances, because now, the first thing to do was to take care of Muba's treatment, who could die at any moment. A disappointed smile came out on Mizari's face. After her granddaughter returned, after all this time, this was the first thing she talked about. Gadis had also gotten into the conversation, daring to interrupt the head disregarding her status, but his friend's life depended on it. Gadis bowed to the shaman and begged her to save Muba. For the sake of this, he was willing to accept any punishment the council would accept for him. Muba, who was suffering the unpleasant side effects of the poison, quietly whispered the ogre's name, unwilling to risk his life for him. Mizary sat silently, her head proudly raised to show the difference in their status. The grandmother noticed the child behind them from the start. The girl was not afraid and only listened attentively to what they were talking about. Looking at her and thinking about Gadis's offer, the head asked him about her being in the temple. Had he really brought the child as tribute? As soon as the little girl heard that, she clenched her fists. The ogre clearly had no intention of giving her away so easily. Because of the human child, he had to endure a fight with a dragon, so he tried to politely refuse the shamaness. However, the girl was ready to sacrifice herself. She understood what tribute and sacrifice meant, so even though she was afraid, she stepped forward and held out her hand, shaking. Even Gadis could see the doubt in her eyes. She certainly didn't want to die, but she was willing to sacrifice her blood. The grandmother looked at the strange child for a long time, but couldn't stand the tension and began to laugh at the amusing situation. For her, it was a surprise that the girl in return voluntarily gave herself to eat. That was enough for her. The human child's courage was noticed, and it was only because of her brave actions that the head agreed to heal Muba. She ordered her to hurry and get her some hot water, and Mizary and Miss Tyne to get ready to assist her. Everyone stirred abruptly, raising a ruckus in the temple. But against all odds, Gadis would still have to receive his punishment later, to which he bowed once more and thanked her for her kindness. The happy child smiled happily standing beside the ogre. They could not believe that the shamaness had agreed to help them, for at first glance, she did not seem so magnanimous. Standing up from his knees, the ogre with the spikes on his shoulders stroked the child's head to express his gratitude. The girl blushed at the praise, but did not remove his hand. While everyone was busy making preparations for Muba's treatment, the fairy flew around looking at everything in her path. As she flew up to the old man, she reported that the shamaness had finished talking to her grandchildren and had begun to give the patient the treatment he deserved, even despite the head's treatment of Gadis. Gahan breathed a sigh of relief at Lianen's words. The wolf that stood behind them worried for his lady's safety, for they had been kicked out of the room. But the forest dweller replied that there had been a time when she had been in danger, but that everything had been resolved safely, and the danger had receded. The dog was not satisfied with this, so he waited for a detailed report. And while they were talking, the old man decided to leave. He had other things to do anyway, so he couldn't keep them company for long. The wolf continued to be stubborn and decided that he would stay at the entrance to await the return of his mistress. Lianen City, hearing that the ogre was about to leave, asked him where he was going, for she did not want to be alone with the wild creature. But the old man did not reveal his plans, so as not to spread panic. There was something he was interested in checking out, so having the fairy join in would be an invaluable help. A stranger appeared on the mountain, where Gadis and the injured Muba were still standing in the morning. He had not expected to stumble upon an ogre settlement in this area, but he was glad for the sudden gift of fate. The girl, who was walking behind the commander, asked Strauss about the further plan of action, but their task was the same, to slaughter the entire population. If it wasn't for the guy's sharp eyes and good instincts, he would have been mutilated. A fist with tremendous force swept past his face, hitting the edge of the cliff. The ground shattered into splinters, causing the group of hunters to bounce aside to avoid injury. Gahan managed to sneak up on them. His hunch was justified after all. Lianen continued to hide behind the old man. She tried not to scream and only flew quietly behind him. The old man still sensed danger from them, so he asked the fairy to continue hiding, because in case of failure, she would be able to inform the others. When Stock from the group of hunters calmed down, he pointed his finger at the ogre and informed the others that he had seen it in the forest a few days ago. The captain assumed it was the red-eyed Gadis, but the unknown man who kept hiding his face disproved his theory, making him think harder. The old man was angry that people kept comparing him to his grandson, making him clench his fists harder and harder. In a rough voice, he saw fit to inform his enemies that he was even stronger than Gadis, which made the hunters tense up. In that case, they couldn't miss him and allow him to return to the settlement to inform the shamaness. They needed to finish him off outside the village. That was an idea everyone agreed on. Gahan was determined to win at all costs. There were too many innocent children in the village for whom he was willing to sacrifice his life, and if the hunters wanted to get rid of him, let them try. Stack couldn't believe that the nameless ogre was standing in front of them, so he relaxed, not feeling the old man as an opponent, but the commander ordered them not to endanger their colleagues and to keep in line. The humans were not going to attack first, so the old man had to be the first to make a move, which Strauss had to fight off. Time after time, the old man stepped on him, trying to deal with the enemies faster. Meanwhile, the shaman and Mizary continued their sorcery, saying incomprehensible words that caused their bodies to be covered with marks. Gadis, who was standing in the corner of the room with the little girl, watched these strange actions. No matter how many times he saw it, it always seemed like some kind of miracle. Beside them, there were assistants who sometimes brought ingredients that were an integral part of the ritual. All of these activities took a tremendous amount of time and effort, but Dasari continued to fulfill her promise. With each spoken word, Muba wrinkled his nose more and more and mumbled something nonsensical, which made the girl start to worry. After a few moments, the boy began to move as if he was having a nightmare, but then he began to choke and cough up blood, leaving thick lumps of congealed blood beside him. As soon as poor Titania saw that the ogre was getting worse, she was ready to rush to his aid regardless of the consequences. Perhaps she would have done so if she hadn't been stopped. The human child had only taken a step before the old shaman ordered her to stop and stand still. Muba was coughing up poison, the tribal leader explained. It was strong enough to kill an ogre, so there wasn't even any point in telling her what it could do to a human child. She would just have to stay where she was and watch. The rest would be up to her. However, the girl felt bad that while her friend was writhing in agony and she couldn't do anything for him. Muba saw how worried the princess was about him, and even though he himself was sickened. But he managed to smile and show the child that he was all right. Even Gadis, who seemed unmoved, tapped the girl a couple times on the shoulder. It hurt him unbearably to look at his sick friend, but in front of the child he couldn't show his weakness. When she turned around at his gesture, Gadis told the child that Muba would be fine because he was in good hands. The princess trusted her savior, so she smiled and waved her head in agreement with his words. It was not for nothing that they dragged him to the village for 10 days. Mizary, who had been distracted from the treatment, smiled at the child in a friendly manner and continued to say that there was nothing to worry about as Muba was being taken care of by professionals and could be relied upon. The grandmother, who was standing next to her, wished to remain silent as the aides smiled and waved their heads. As Desari's gaze fell on the child, she realized more and more that the girl looked like her familiar. 20 years ago, humanity had gathered an army and ruthlessly attacked their settlement, which had been living peacefully without even attacking humans. Then, young Desari was forced to participate in the war to protect the clan. She worked hard to keep the humans from slaughtering the ogres. She was driven only by her lust for life. The shamaness didn't understand how this could have happened, or what led to it. No matter how many times she crushed them, the humans kept rebuilding. And the ranks of warriors rose up before her again and again. Finally, Desari spotted a distant silhouette on a horse behind the backs of the warriors. Then she saw her. A woman with blonde hair on a horse who commanded the troops and kept their morale up by periodically raising her sword and flag to the sky. She was like the goddess of victory that commanded the army from the rear. However, looking at the mountains of corpses of her kin, the shamaness realized that she was not that kind of goddess. She was more like a woman who carried death, a Valkyrie. She brought destruction to friends and foes alike, turning her soldiers into rabid beasts that did not fear death. In the end, they were barely left alive. Their bodies were covered in blood, and they themselves were tired to death. There were dozens of survivors left of their settlement. Humanity must have suffered a huge amount of casualties. But what did the goddess accomplish with this? Someone told me that after this battle, the woman, due to her accomplishments, married a nobleman and put the war behind her. Looking at Titania, she had to admit to herself that the child turned out to be an exact copy of that goddess of death after all. Worried about the condition of the recently ill shamaness, the assistant asked if Desari was all right, who froze in place and stared at the child. The grandmother thought she was going crazy for seeing a monster in such a bright child, and continued her work, immersed in her thoughts. The treatment was almost over, so the tribe had asked Mizary to memorize the technique. Though it was hard to perform, it was versatile and useful. Realizing the responsibility, Mizary began to stutter, not understanding why she deserved such a favor, but she did not argue. Now Muba could rest easy, because the poison had been removed from his body, and all that remained was to wait for his awakening. Miston, who was standing near Gadis, asked his opinion of the poison his friend had gotten, but the man was only worried about Muba. Mizary's brother, however, crossed his arms over his chest, narrowed his eyes and repeated that he wasn't asking about their friend, but specifically about the people who dared to use the poison so boldly. However, the ogre with the spikes on his shoulders thought the humans were just hunters that roamed the forest, so he said what he thought was right. Hearing this answer, Miston decided to ask a follow-up question that would make even a fool understand what he was getting at. Miston asked him if he really thought that some hunters who were wandering deep in the forest had poison-soaked arrows. It was clear that they had deliberately chosen the strongest poison that could kill an ogre, and only a shaman could cure it. Gadis knew what he was getting at, but he asked Miston what he meant. Miston explained to him that he was talking about a mercenary group that specialized in monster hunting. Even judging by their arsenal, it was clear that the ogres were professionals. Lianen Sidi covered her mouth with her hands in horror so as not to attract attention. Known as the Azure Twins and led by a man called Strauss, the mercenaries stood unharmed in front of the ogre's body. Even within the monster ranks, they were known as the strongest monster hunters one could meet. After defeating Gehan, they placed his body on huge sharp needles and watched the settlement, thus confirming their nickname. The old man hung his body on the stakes where the viscous blood flowed. The men used the most extraordinary traps to kill their enemies, killing them long and painfully. Leanan covered her mouth with her hands as she looked at the horror that could have instantly jeopardized her life. Gehan began to cough up blood, and thus moved lower and lower on the needles deepening his wounds. The forest dweller could not afford to remain idle, so it took her a few minutes to gather her thoughts. There was a reason she had gone with her grandfather after all. Now she needed to get back to Gadis and the others as soon as possible to tell them what had happened. While the mercenaries were deciding what to do with the ogre, Mercy looked at the small creature that had begun to move away from them. Strauss called out to the captain that there was something in the distance, and when he looked ahead, he confirmed her words. Some time ago, before the monster had attacked them, it had mumbled something, but the men had paid no attention. The boy assumed the creature looked a little like some kind of fairy, but either way they couldn't let the creature have time to warn the village. Bringing Stack to his feet, the head ordered him to take care of the forest dweller. Naturally for him, such an order was easy to fulfill. Taking a small stone, the young man tossed it in the air a couple of times, getting used to its weight, and then swung the blunt weapon. He had a keen eye, so aiming was no problem, and he hit the right target. The stone hit Leonin in the head, and she started to fall down feeling dizzy. For a while, the fairy's body rolled forward on the ground, wiping her skin and blood. She looked back at the people who had dared to hurt her and squinted in anticipation of what they would do next. Stake yelped when he saw the wounded forest fairy continue to crawl forward. At this, the girl yelled for their friend to hurry up as soon as possible and get the matter over with. It wasn't enough for any fairy to escape from the humans yet. As they focused their thoughts fully on the winged creature, Gehan managed to pull himself together. The elderly ogre's eyes were bloodshot and his muscles tensed, forcing his body to dull the pain of his injuries. Stack cheerfully assured his friend to stop being nervous, because he was going to finish off the little enemy anyway. But he was too relaxed to even hear Gehan crumbling the stakes beneath him. The ogre was quickly near the boy, and the worried Mercy had to call out to her friend. The reckless boy kept twirling the stone on his finger, ready to kill the fairy, but turning his head at his friend's screams, he saw a huge maw from which a scream came out straight into his face. Meanwhile, the evil Strauss pulled his sword from its sheath and shouted loudly at his charges, warning them to be safe. Swinging his weapon at the monster's body, he expected to defeat the monster as easily as the first time, but the ogre managed to dodge. The commander's eyes began to run sideways, and his teeth gritted, because the guy didn't think that the ogre would be able to dodge the hunter's direct and accurate strike. But the old man continued to rage and attack. Their strength seemed to be in direct proportion to their anger, which only made them stronger. Lianan Insida shouted her grandfather's name, and when he heard, he asked her to go to the village as soon as possible. Though the fairy's head was spinning and ringing from the shock, but she agreed to his request. After all, that was what she went with him for. Strauss couldn't let his team die in this battle and ordered them to dodge the monster's blows to the last. Gehan, despite the fact that the spikes that had recently pierced through him and continued to stick in his body, was still trying to destroy people. The blood from the ogre's wounds poured out in streams, making his body wet. The old man didn't stop for a second, chasing the annoying hunters around in a circle. In order to organize the fairy's retreat, the ogre sent a blow into the ground, which sent a huge cloud of dust into the air, which like a smoke grenade perfectly covered the eye. Leanan quickly flew away from the battlefield, but promised that she would call everyone she found and would surely return. Meanwhile, there was a quiet ghoul in the shamaness temple that alerted everyone. Looking around, Gadis excitedly turned to his grandmother and asked what had just happened. However, Dasari continued to sit calmly in her small throne in front of Muba's body. According to her, there was no reason to panic, just a small earthquake. Since it was just nature messing around somewhere in the bowels of the earth, there was nothing the ogre could do about it, so he continued to ask how his friend was doing. The aides that had been standing with the shamaness the whole time replied that they had neutralized the poison. Dasari emphasized that they had done all they could, and the rest depended solely on Muba's body and its ability to recover. Gadis breathed a sigh of relief watching the boy sleep peacefully after the treatment. He and Titania watched joyfully as their friend whose life was no longer threatened. But their idyll was interrupted by a quick stomping of feet, followed by the appearance of a wolf, who reported that there was a new problem. Gadis hadn't expected Ku-sit to leave the place where they'd left him and disobey the girl's orders, so he was surprised. Dasari wasn't happy about the dog's presence in such a sacred place, so she tried to chase him away. But the wolf denied the fact that he was called a dog, because he was just a spirit in that form. But even now there was no time for bickering, and he asked for some time. In his mouth, he managed to bring the injured Lean and Sidi, who was breathing heavily and whimpering. The little girl hadn't expected that after they had miraculously managed to heal Muba, a new injured member of the team would arrive. Taking the fairy from the dog's mouth, Gadis asked the one, had he really decided to eat her after all? Mizary had always guessed that the forest creature was not happy in this world, but she didn't think Ku-sith would be able to cripple her. The child was angry at the pet when he saw such a picture that made it seem like the wolf would cry. He begged not to be called that and covered his ears with his paws to listen to what Leanin had to say. Gadis brought the fairy closer to his face to hear what the wounded creature, who kept muttering something, had to say. When she opened her eyes, she called the ogre by name and told him that Gehan was fighting the human hunters right now. Gadis couldn't believe what was being said. Mistin was standing not far from him and had heard everything. Only the Azure mercenaries could do that, so he was ready to accompany them to the hunters. However, his grandmother, who was against it, forbade them to go out. They would handle them on their own. At that moment, 3 huge ogres entered the building, led by an ogre with a mask in place of a former horn. The shamaness was sending Sabin into battle. Gadis had already been banished from the village once before, and so right now he would be arrested and locked up for a while. The bandage guy smiled slyly when he saw Gadis that he had once dared to insult him. It had been quite some time since the day they last met, but he hadn't forgotten exactly who had broken his horn. Gadis promised to do whatever he was ordered to do for saving his friend, so when his sentence was pronounced, he was taken outside the village boundary. There was a small ledge near a small waterfall that was a few meters below the edge of the cliff. In a way, it resembled a solitary prison in which exiles were imprisoned. One of Sabin's friends, who was accompanying the ogre, looked down at him and grinned, asking him what it was like to be a prisoner. But Gadis was no stranger to it. He also sarcastically replied that everything was fine until his nasty face showed up here. The ogre continued to stare at Gadis, realizing the desperation he was in, as it was only possible to get off the ledge with someone else's help, and his ugly face suited him just fine. The ogre tossed the bowl of food he'd brought down without much thought to the height. It was lunch for Gadis, which had long since gone cold. The plate shattered with a clang and all the food spilled out onto the rocks. Gadis looked calmly at the only food he had seen during that long day, but he said nothing to the ogre. Now was not the time to think about food. The guards, on Saban's orders, had also sealed off the passage to the cliff with huge stones that stood close together as a double defense. In such a case, Gadis had no chance of escape. The deed was done, and they left the prisoner alone. However, the 2 ogres, Gravid and Bailiff, were stopped halfway home, and then the ogres saw the 2 kin. In front of them stood Mistin and her sister, who needed to have a word with them, and since Titania's savior was locked up, she had followed Mizary and was here as well. Mistin thought that sealing Gadis in the air prison was too harsh a punishment, as only ogres that had committed the unpardonable sin were sent there. In this case, Gadis just wanted to help Muba, who was in critical condition, and in this case he should be moved elsewhere. Even Mizary was angrily pointing her finger at them and reminding them that his grandmother liked him and had accepted him as a guest. When Gravid heard the shaman's name, he began to back off, saying that Sabin had given him that order, and there was nothing he could do about it. Bailiff didn't want to listen to Mizary either, so he sent her to complain to whoever had ordered it. Mistin was determined to resolve the situation and demanded to be shown where Gadis was now, but Saban decided to come himself. He replied that Gadis was forbidden to leave and the rules had to be followed. He didn't care even if the ogre shaman disagreed with that decision. Mizary's brother continued to resent the ogre's willfulness and would not leave the situation alone. He asked for a change of punishment for his friend. However, when he saw what Sabin was dragging behind him, he opened his mouth in mute question. Sabin brought someone's forearm that had been neatly cut off with a sharp object. They had found it in the desert that was between the mountains. From the way things were going, the hand probably belonged to a Gehan. Mizary raised her voice to ask where Gehan was, but they were unable to find his body. Considering that part of the rock was completely destroyed, the chance of finding the old ogre was nil. The ogre, though elderly, was not weak. It was hard to believe that such a skillful warrior who had survived the war of 20 years ago had died so quickly. Saban, seeing the human child, approached and spoke to her, asking if she belonged to Mizary. The former princess was confused when she heard the news about the old man, and when the hornless ogre spoke to her, she was frightened. Sabin, who was holding her grandfather's hand, asked her to approach him, but the girl, on the contrary, slowly moved away from him. His subordinates were surprised when he sat down on a level with the girl and showed concern. But Saban saw nothing surprising in it, the strong need to take care of the weak. Perhaps the fairy was right, that mercy for human children was embedded right into the ogre's DNA. Though he wasn't rude to the child and spoke as affectionately as he could, the child clasped her hands together and moved farther away from the ogre. Eventually, she hid behind Mizary's back and listened to their conversation from there. It was not the first time Saban had been rebuffed, and his subordinates began to mock the commander who had failed to gain Titania's trust. He didn't listen to them for long, and after that he started waving his fists and telling them to shut up. He was sure that the child simply did not realize his greatness, and they should not forget their place. However, his friendly squabble was interrupted by Mistin, who remained calm in such a situation. He told Sabin that Lian and Sidhe had brought news of a group of dangerous people roaming around. The settlement should be prepared for their hero, Gadis, the strongest of the ogres, to be asked for help to deal with them. This was a turn of events the hornless ogre could not allow. He could no longer listen to this Gadis who had once crippled him. Gathering all the strength in his left hand, Saban struck the rock, shattering it into pieces. He wasn't happy with what Mistin had just said about him and was ready for a fight, but decided to just warn him for once. Saban decided that he himself was the strongest of the ogres. That's what he told anyone and everyone who dared to praise Gadis in front of him. Scared of the evil ogre, Mistin covered the princess who was standing near Mizary with his hand. With such statements, Sabin surprised everyone. Gravid and Bailiff continued to praise their commander. They were sure that Gadis had used a dirty trick to defeat him then, for no one could be stronger than Sabin. Further, Saban was unwilling to talk to his annoying family. They believed that even without Mizary and Mistin, they would be able to defeat the people Gehan was captive to. At the end, he emphasized that he was not letting Gadis go, and anyone who disobeyed his orders would be punished. When they were ready to go, he turned to Mizary, who did not yet know what to do in this difficult situation. Sabin told her that he was waiting for a positive answer and what she would tell Desiree about him. Meanwhile, the ogre shamaness continued to sit in her throne in front of Muba, surrounded by servants and a dog that could not be kicked out. One of Granny's subordinates asked Desiree about her next decision regarding Saban. She seemed to have other things on her mind, but the shamaness decided to answer. With a hand on her cheek, she murmured that she would continue to follow the traditions of the ogres in forming a bond with Sabin's family so that they could strengthen their position. Since Mizary had agreed to become an ogre shaman, she should have the courage to go even further and would do whatever it took. And so passed a day that was full of new experiences and sad news. The stars began to appear in the sky, plunging the land into darkness. In the desert at night it is cold because the sand cools down quickly, so everyone hid in the houses. The ogre woman picked up the baby in her arms and carried the child on her shoulder. Mistin wasn't surprised and just watched their friendship. They walked carefree to their homes, not knowing that Desiree had told Sabin to let him take Mizary as his wife. At the same time, a hungry Gadis sat alone on a ledge looking up at the stars. Desiree began treating the fairy as soon as she arrived at the temple. She had her blood cleaned, her wounds treated, and her head bandaged. All that was left to do was to keep an eye on the child, and then she would be back to normal immediately. The grandmother shaman was kind to the child and calmly explained to her everything about the care of the sick fairy. Since the victim belongs to mythical creatures, namely fairies, the recovery was different from human beings. They have a similar concept to vampires or succubi. Absorbing a human's life energy, it turns it into its own power, causing it to recover. However, Desiree warned the child not to do this until she had made the contract, for until this important point was fulfilled, she would not be able to do anything right and would only bring harm to the princess. Finished with the human child, she called to her granddaughter who stood leaning against the wall. The shamaness asked the ogre woman what had brought her to the temple with such a sullen look, which actually annoyed Mizary. She didn't even want to say it, so she asked her grandmother if she had any idea, since this conversation would be about Sabin. Turning her back to Mizary, she assumed it would be about their marriage, which caused a look of surprise on the child's face. Dasari decided to remind her that the ogre shaman existed to ensure the prosperity of his settlement, even if it meant sacrificing his own desires. Dasari was more than confident that her granddaughter understood the significance of this marriage and therefore would not refuse. Mistin, who had come along with his sister, blocked her way before she made a mess of things. He made a motion to the grandmother to postpone this conversation and Gadis's punishment. She waited patiently for her grandchildren to finish their proposals, and then calmly replied that they were running out of time and had nowhere else to postpone. The shamaness announced that the ceremony would take place in a week, and it would be better for everyone to prepare. But when the relatives heard this, they shouted in protest because everything was happening too fast and thought that the shamaness had made a selfish decision. While they were shouting behind the successor, there were a few helpers who came to fetch Mizary, as she had to prepare for the ceremony, so they asked her to come with them. However, Mizary kept saying that she wouldn't go to hell voluntarily, but she was advised to keep her head down. If she resisted the marriage, there was a chance that Gadis would be given the death penalty. Such a setup from her own grandmother Mizary hadn't expected. Frowning her eyebrows, she looked at the shamaness and expected her to rescind the order, but she was adamant. The head of the tribe looked calmly at the tapestries in front of her, hiding her emotions. The aide pressed Mizary to follow her, to which she doomedly agreed, leaving Mizary alone in the temple. The child's bright eyes could spot all her hidden desires, and this time was no exception. Only the little girl, who kept her secret silent, noticed the drooping gaze of the elderly shamaness. At some point everyone had left the temple, and now you could see the grandmother's shoulders shaking. Every day it was getting harder and harder for her to hide her pain. Even now she could barely hide the way she was choking on her blood. It was hard for her to hold back, but it was all for the happy future of the village. In an instant, tears came to her eyes and rolled down her cheeks in hail. She apologized to Mizary, who was long gone, but the shaman couldn't let the ogres split into two factions. They needed to avoid war at all costs. With Gehan gone and Gadis imprisoned, that could be accomplished. No one else could stand up in protest of the ceremony. Desiree fell to her knees and sobbed like a little child while Titania, lurking around the corner, watched her. Mistin, who had noticed the girl left behind, asked her what was wrong, but she wished to leave it at that and ran up to him. If the girl gets bored, she can come to her brother Mizary, because he was the only person who could look after her. That was why he would welcome her into his home as an honored guest. Now that she had only Mistin left, she wished to follow him until Gadis was released. After they left the temple, the girl and the wolf followed Mistin to his house. Meanwhile, the guy with the bandage on his horn was having a good time. He got word that Mizary had agreed to accept his marriage proposal to Mizary. Everything went smoothly while Gehan was away, and Gustis languished in prison. While everyone suffered in their own musings, Sabin continued to party with the three beautiful ladies. No one else would go against his word, which the beauties congratulated him on. The ogres that supported Sabin's side idealized him and vowed to follow him to the end. Hearing such a statement, Saban laughed and thanked them for their loyalty. Finally, after many years, Mizary would belong unconditionally to him alone. Then he would call himself king of the ogres with his own harem. While he rested chatting with his company, someone was awake and breaking the silence of the night. Walking past the rocky terrain, a shiver enveloped his body from the chill of the night wind. Entering a small crevice, no one stopped for a second. Every moment was worth its weight in gold. Titania looked back periodically, trying to walk as quietly as possible without attracting attention. The wolf could not let the child go alone and went with her, still carrying the magic creature at her belt. She could not remain inconspicuous, however, and when someone behind her accidentally coughed, Titania froze in place. The wolf did the same for her mistress, and there was an awkward silence. The girl turned back to see who was wandering around in the middle of the night, praying not to be seen. But behind her she saw only a familiar silhouette, who stood with his back turned to her. Mistin didn't stop the princess, but simply came out to give some advice that might help her tonight. No one ever escaped from the air prison, but they always left someone on guard there just in case. However, it was possible to find a loophole everywhere. Some of the ogres were overconfident of the dungeon's security, so at night they could afford to drink and sleep well. Just like the day the little one had ventured into the dungeon. The entrance was also blocked with two huge stones that no man could have lifted in his life. but a small child could squeeze through the small opening that was left between the stones. Also, Brother Mizary advised to use a rope for transporting prisoners, which was carelessly thrown always near the cliff. The wolf helped the girl with everything, and while she was trying out the height, he brought one end of the braided rope. Taking it from the dog's mouth, the girl thanked him for his help and tied it around her waist and then secured it with a thick and secure knot. The wolf asked her mistress to be as careful as possible while the dog guarded her on the other side of the rocks. The girl picked up a small pebble that she let fly before she went downstairs. She didn't exactly calculate the distance and just wanted it to fall near Gadis. But the nimble stone skipped along the wall and hit the top of the sleeping ogre's head, which was unsuspecting. Opening his eyes, he rubbed the impact and looked at the object that had rolled to his feet. When he looked at the object, he saw a picture that he had not expected to see until the end of his release from prison. At that moment, the child was climbing down a jagged rock, clinging to small ledges. Gadis was greatly surprised that Titania had dared such a brave but reckless act and screamed at the girl out of fear, asking what the hell she was doing. Even the wolf, who remained on the other side of the cliff holding a rope in his teeth, heard this. The beast was just as startled when the guard grudgingly raised his head while continuing to mutter something in a drunken sleep. The human child quickly put a finger to his lips and hissed, telling the ogre not to make a fuss. Realizing that the child had come without permission to visit Gadis, quickly covered his mouth with his hands and fell silent. The guard thought he heard what he heard and scratched his head in frustration, not bothering to check the dungeon. The wolf had been standing 2 meters away from him the whole time, and he was worried about any noise. To his surprise, the drunken ogre calmly went to sleep, waving goodbye to his work. Such an irresponsible attitude the beast had never met before, but he exhaled with relief and continued to carefully lower the rope. The girl stopped on the rocks that stuck out in the cliff and listened to the sounds. To her great relief, the rustling stopped, and she calmed down a bit as she realized it was safe to continue down. As soon as she descended close enough to the ogre, he held his hands up and asked the princess to descend as carefully as possible. However, Titania wouldn't be herself without freaking out about something. The girl with joy on her face jumped the male ogre straight into the man's arms, forcing her to catch her. It was hard for her, but she had managed to sneak up on him and was now calmly wiping her forehead. It was clearly visible that she was happy to see her friend, but his next action startled the girl. Gadis asked in a raised tone why the child had come to see him. Had Muba gotten worse, or had something happened to Gehan? This reaction and the number of questions caused the child to shake and stammer, which brought Gadis to his senses. It was as if he had been electrocuted and realized what he had done. Ogre looked away and was silent for a while. He had to apologize, and so he grabbed the rope. The little girl had come to him for a reason. Something had happened in the village, and when he asked her about it, the girl nodded, confirming his guess. Gadis only had one hand free, so he asked the child to hold onto him tighter. Luckily for the girl, running away now was just another crime on Gadis's list. The human child comforted the ogre by saying that it would only get better and there was no need to question his actions. However, something did surprise them. The rock they were climbing began to rumble like an earthquake. Instantly, the rocks that Saban had told them to put up as protection began to lose their balance. They slid apart and one of them woke the guard. When he wiped his eyes to see what was happening, he saw only a part of the rock falling on him. Realizing that he had to run, the wolf jumped aside and found himself between the two rocks, which is not the case with the ogre, which left only bloody splashes. The rope under the weight of Gadis began to run away from the beast's clutches. While he was saving his own life, he lost the lifeline that the girl was using to get down, which put her in danger. She was not secured, and there was nothing to tie her to. Gadis found himself in free flight, watching as he drifted away from the edge he had almost climbed to. The frightened girl clutched at his neck while watching the artificially induced rockfall. Meanwhile, preparations for the wedding were in full swing in the temple. Mizary repeatedly called her granddaughter a beauty. Even a tomboy could look good if she tried. Mizary was dressed in a long, light-colored dress with an elaborate embroidered pattern around the edges. The girls with the blindfold on their faces kept helping her with the outfit, adjusting the dress to her figure. They would have continued fitting until the next day, trying to make everything as perfect as possible. But the ground beneath their feet began to vibrate instantly, and then they heard a noise. It was clearly not an earthquake. Turning to the temple entrance, Mizary concluded that the sound was more akin to an explosion. The shamanist's servants ran around the building looking for her grandmother, and after they met her, reported what had happened. Many explosions were heard around their village. Many of the villagers saw flashes of light, which made it clear that they had been invaded. The hunters had destroyed several buildings in the village, and panic had broken out. Mizary was horrified and ran out into the street. Suddenly another explosion was heard and dozens of rocks rolled down the slope, making the ground shake. The explosions continued unabated, leaving behind a flat surface covered with rock fragments. Now their settlement was visible from any direction, and the mountains that had hidden them behind them disappeared as if they had never existed. Many ogres were trapped under the rubble, not expecting a sudden human attack. 20 years of peace and quiet ended in an insidious attack. The ogres did not realize what was happening as they slept peacefully in their homes. Some might not realize, remaining in eternal sleep. One of the villagers was crushed by 2 stones and tried to get out, leaving finger marks. But it was only a moment before he saw the ground instantly spinning before his eyes. Blood spurted in all directions as his head flew off into the distance, and then his body collapsed and never moved again. Strauss had put the ogre out of his misery, and now he would take no part in this war. He had taken his life with a long sword with liquid blood running down it. Cheerful Mercy constantly distracted the commander and asked him to look at the work of the explosives. She did a great job and saved them a lot of time. However, the captain asked her to focus and not waste her energies on useless chatter. After all, they had come here with the goal of destroying the entire settlement. Not a single ogre was to be left alive. In such a short period of time, there was no trace of the village's former grandeur. Everything was destroyed and scattered in different directions. Most of the buildings had collapsed like a house of cards, leaving behind small piles. Sabin's team didn't understand what had happened, because just a minute ago they had been in a house that had been leveled to the ground. They watched the destruction in shock, digesting what was happening. The girls who had entertained them were now sitting in blood and crying. Of all 3 of them, only one had managed to survive. Mistine had told him earlier that there were people who had learned the explosive device to kill, which meant the destruction in the village was their work. He hadn't even realized that the devious humans could go that far. Meanwhile, Gadis tried to stop his fall from the ledge and continue his escape from the air prison. However, the rope would not catch on anything. The wolf ran for the end, so that he could grab it in time to pull out the child that was helping him heal. But no matter how fast he ran to the rope, it still managed to slip away, and now the dog could not pull them out. All he had to do was watch the ogre and the girl die. But Gadis did not agree with the decision of fate and did everything he could to save himself. He had survived the dragon, which is some height to him, so he took the situation into his own hands. Once he was at a good distance from the rock, he struck in front of him with all his might. His strength was enough to break through the thick wall and thus stop in place. Gadis asked the girl to hold on tight, for now he would move quickly. Ramming his fists into the rocks, he climbed higher and higher, leaving only holes in the rock. The wolf could not believe his eyes. It was the first time he had ever seen someone climb a smooth rock with their bare hands. He stepped back as Gadis climbed up, grabbing the edge with his large hand. Titania was at his head, and she was the first to see the beast. Meanwhile, the ogre was shaking with exertion and trying to hold on while the girl would be able to climb down. As soon as the princess was on solid ground, the dog, like a loyal servant, rushed to lick his mistress and praise Gadis. He was glad they were back in safety. However, it was still too early to relax. Gadis continued to hang on the edge of the cliff, and so he had to be helped. The human child was sure the ogre couldn't get out without her, so she grabbed Gadis by his long hair. She tried with all her might to pull him out, but only continued to slide in place. Even at close range, it was clear that the child would not be able to help an ogre that was several hundred times heavier than her. She herself was the size of his head, to say nothing of her strength. Gadis felt sorry for her, so he gathered all his strength to help her a little. The next time the princess tried to pull him out, the ogre himself kicked his legs off the rock, causing the child to roll in the opposite direction of him. After a few somersaults, Titania remained on her back, but looked at her friend with a smile on her face. Meanwhile, Gadis was rubbing the tuft of hair that the little helper had tried to save him with. And not in vain he held on to it, because at the last attempt the child had torn out a piece of hair, from which she flew aside. She was very sorry for what she had done, and stretching her hands forward, she bowed in apology and gave Gadis back his hair. However, Gadis assured her not to worry over such a trifle. After all, she had done it for the sake of saving him. But even saving him wasn't as important as making sure she had time to join forces with Mizary and the others. The village was in chaos, with the smoke from the explosives filling the air with sulfur. Strauss and his team were rushing between the rocks, moving to another point. This destructive power not only impressed the entire settlement that was affected by it, but also the monster hunters. Even Mercy, who was running at the end, said that the rocks fell like dominoes, and since there were no guards, they managed to place the bombs in all the places they wanted. The guy with the mask on his face replied to the girl that even if the ogres had managed to figure it out, they still didn't understand it. Not with their mental faculties. However, Strauss stopped his charges, interrupting their merry conversation. 3 ogres met on their way. They had managed to find the humans making a lot of noise in the settlement. Sabin was ready to tear them apart, limb by limb. Strauss turned to his men and asked them what to call these ogres, but they did not know. Only guessed that they were among the nameless ones they had never met before. The masked man decided to take the case himself, and sent Strauss himself to the temple to meet the shamaness of the ogres. It should be so, the guy was not a weakling, and little-known ogres are unlikely to kill him. So wishing him luck, Mercy went with their head to deal with the others. The hornless ogre was shaking with anger. He was constantly being underestimated, which irritated him greatly, causing Bailiff to worry about him. The hunter who had stayed behind to fight them stood quietly in front of the ogres, monotonously asking where Gadis was. Everyone needed that jerk again, Saban thought. He wasn't being put down for anything. The boy again questioned the one-horned ogre about whether he understood him. Red-eyed Gadis and the human girl definitely had to be in the settlement, so he waited for an answer. Gadis here, Gadis there. Sabin was fed up with this, so the ogre raised his club and swung it at the human with shouts. He kept saying that he was the strongest ogre, so everyone should recognize only him. While he was clouded by his rage, the hunter began to conjure, repeating certain words. Fire necklace, feather mantle, kill my enemy. The spell took a little time to cast, but the effect exceeded all expectations. A bright flash was at the level of Sabin's hand as he swung the wooden club. He had been overconfident, and he had paid for it. Instantly there was nothing left of his arm. Pain erupted all over his body as blood splattered on the ground. He fell to his knees, all the while repeating, my hand. Gravid and Bailiff rushed to help their comrade as he squirmed in pain. They had clearly underestimated the enemy. Even though he was alone, the guy was a member of one of the strongest mercenary factions. He alone was enough to overpower 3 monsters. Faceless leaned over to Sabin and repeated his question. Where is the red-eyed Gadis? He asked the one-horned ogre. Or should he call him one-armed? Sabin, unable to bear the torture, told him where the hunter's target was. And now the masked man was walking down the narrow path. The faceless man let the ogres go home and headed for the air prison. When the ogres heard that they were being released, they were surprised and asked what was the catch since they were not going to be killed. However, there was no catch. Faceless One didn't know what their leader would say, but his only job was to finish off Gadis and the little girl who ran around with him. He didn't care about the rest of the ogres. Besides, he didn't have time to babysit weaklings like them, so it would be better for the ogres to just leave in silence and not provoke the hunter to bloodshed. Saban didn't like the hunter looking down on them, but he couldn't help it because he was already crippled. Meanwhile, Gadis and the princess were getting farther away from their prison. The girl walked merrily, waving her arms. For now her friend was free, and she was sure that he would in any case resolve what was happening in the village. As they walked quietly forward, and the waistband of the little girl began to move and stick out her head. The fairy had finally awakened from her long sleep. She had managed to regain her vitality for the day while feeding off the girl's energy. Sticking her arms out, she turned her head in different directions, examining her surroundings, which already seemed unfamiliar to her. The fairy had been dragged into the battlefield while she was unconscious, and now she was beginning to panic. Lianan's city was finally healed, and when she opened her eyes, she began to scream wildly, confirming it. Seeing the global destruction, she remembered that it had once been the same with the dragon, so waving her arms, she begged to stop dragging her into her mess. Gadis was glad the forest creature was feeling better, but continued to hold her head, asking her to keep her cool. Still, her screaming was making even his brain melt. The wolf reminded the fairy that before she forgot, the ogres had saved her life, so it would be nice if she would calmly continue to help. However, Linan did not relent, and resented the fact that her body stank for some reason. Had the beast done something to her while she was unconscious? However, the wolf decided to remain silent, and not remind her of the fact that he carried her in his mouth. Though the fairy screamed, it wasn't enough for anyone in the village to hear her, so Gadis was still surprised when an unfamiliar figure blocked their path. A guy wearing a mask that resembled an owl looked up at the ogre from under his hood. He greeted him and said he was glad to meet such a famous creature. It had been a long time since he had seen Titania. The princess felt as if she had been splashed with cold water as the horrible memories of the past came back to her mind, and she trembled. The guy's voice alone was enough for her to remember who he belonged to. The girl started shaking and stepped back, hiding behind Gadis, who asked the child if she was okay. The fairy also recognized the stranger, for he was one of the hunters that had attacked Gahan. As soon as the ogre heard that he was involved in the attack on the old ogre, he was angry and shouted that it was unforgivable. But Lenin stopped Gadis, who was about to attack the unknown man. The hunter's strength was abnormally high, so he shouldn't have attacked recklessly. The guy was annoyed by how calmly the great Gadis was talking to his comrades in his presence. He could see from a kilometer away the evil aura he exuded when he began to cast his sorcery. Even the wolf was surprised at the sheer amount of mana this man had. The forest fairy turned pale with fear when she saw that this magic was a subspecies of flame magic. He just wanted to burn everything. Lenin shouted to Gadis to do everything to prevent him from continuing the spell, and by no means let it hit him. It was too late, however. The faceless hunter reached forward, directing the power to a specific point. A bright flash appeared at Gadis's chest, which he was very surprised by. It only took the mage 10 seconds to do so. The light blinded his eyes, making him squint, but like the fairy had said, he couldn't let the magic touch him, so Gadis tensed the muscles of his arms, putting maximum strength there. He simply squeezed the flash with 2 palms, and now the light couldn't be released outward. The magic worked, but the damage was minor. The spell merely fried the skin of his hands. It seemed to work on the principle of fire, which was fueled by oxygen, and by squeezing his palms, Gadis created a vacuum that made the spell work differently. The faceless man stepped back when he saw that his killing magic didn't work. This was the second time in his life he had screwed up like this. In response, Gadis swung his huge arm regardless of the fact that it was slightly hurt. Gadis hit the ground the mage was standing on and turned it into a pile of rocks. Since the guy in the hoodie was standing on the edge of the road, he jumped back into the cliff, but his wings prevented him from falling, allowing him to stay safely in the air where no one could reach him. To Gadis, the mage was a coward, so he demanded that he return rather than tucking his tail and flying away. What a surprise it was to the faceless man when he realized what the ogre had done. He had suppressed the magic ball at the point of direct ignition with his bare hands. Gadis had seen this kind of magic before, so he knew what to do with it. Leonin and Sida began to smile widely, opening her eyes and looking at the masked guy hovering in the distance. However, not even magic could defeat a sharp mind, uttered the wolf upon hearing the ogre's words. Gadis quickly asked the beast to be quiet as it made him blush, and he obediently calmed down. The warlock continued to fly not far away. He didn't want to waste his strength for such a pointless fight either. In the last 20 years, the guy had not met anyone with the level of strength and intelligence that Gadis had, so he was glad to experience the same feelings as in that long-ago war against the ogres. This time, Gadis was truly angry. The guy who was hiding under the dark cloak admitted that he was a participant in that bloody battle that took the lives of many. The man floating in the sky didn't expect the ogre's nerves to give out so quickly, though it was to be expected with his unfortunate fate. Gadis had no intention of listening to the hunter's nonsense and shouted at him to stop. But the man did not calm down and continued to ask why the ogre continued to protect Titania. Or was it still better to ask why he continued to treat her like a slave? In the mage's opinion, the ogre with the spikes on his shoulders was no different from the nobles. But Gadis didn't understand what he was saying and waited calmly for what he would say next. When he heard the answer, however, he had an epiphany. The faceless man pointed at the princess and said that 20 years ago the Supreme Commander Marianne organized and led the war. The girl the ogres had spent so much time with was a direct descendant of her. The child shook, continuing to hug the fairy. She would probably never forget the look in Gadis's eyes, who looked down at her with a mixture of regret and fury in his eyes. In a way, Gadis couldn't even believe he was protecting the daughter of an enemy he hated.